Chapter 1. My Mother is Martha. The air smelled as clean and fresh as on the first day of the world. A gentle breeze swept across the golden wheat fields, as soft as a benediction. On a cool autumn night, a red pickup truck eased down a country road in rural Kansas. From the endless fields on either side came the chirp of crickets and the lazy dance of fireflies like flecks of starlight. The night sky was a scatter of cold diamonds. Music hummed from the car radio. The familiar scent of earth and rain drifted in. Jonathan Kent, a new father, stuck his hand out the window and enjoyed the wind, a broad smile tugging at his lips. "Jonathan, this is God's gift," his wife said. Martha had just been discharged from the hospital after giving birth. Her face was still a little pale, but she cradled the quiet, perfect baby like the most precious thing in the world. Her voice was hoarse with exhaustion and tenderness. "I only wanted a child for a short time, and he came to us like an angel. God's gift." Inside, a voice that remembered another life repeated it with stunned disbelief. "My mother is Martha?" In this life, my parents were Jonathan and Martha Kent. I'd woken up as a newborn in Metropolis Hospital, which meant impossibly that I'd crossed into the dark, dangerous DC universe and become the adopted son of Superman's foster parents. "Of course," Jonathan said, smiling into the rearview mirror at his wife. "He'll grow up healthy and strong." A tremor of consternation cut his sentence short. Rumble. A meteor streaked across the sky, a fiery comet that split the night. Rocks and debris pelted the earth, a scatter of burning fragments that set fields aglow and sent dirt flying. One enormous meteor slammed down directly in front of the road, gouging a deep chasm and blocking their path like a verdict. "Oh my God!" Jonathan stomped the brakes. Tires shrieked and smoked as the pickup fishtailed and came to a lopsided stop at the ditch. He glanced back. "Martha, are you and the baby all right?" "I'm fine, Jonathan." Martha hugged the child to her chest as he braked. The baby in her arms was unharmed, soft-skinned, peaceful, blinking at the commotion with bright eyes. The son of Krypton arrived with the meteorites, just as they said. The ground shuddered. A distant, ear-splitting roar rolled out across the fields. Even with that sound, the infant in Martha's arms did not cry. He only watched, curious rather than frightened. Something small and ancient awoke inside him, a dispassionate, mechanical notice. Host's birth detected. Loading Thanos template. David remembered the emotionless voice in his ear within moments of being born. He had acquired a Thanos template, an eternal physique, immediately. The integration was only 30% at first. To complete it, he needed emotion points. He could earn those points by influencing the emotions of powerful or pivotal characters in the DC universe. He had already collected a few from the kindness radiating from the couple holding him. But the arrival of the son of Krypton was only the beginning. Through the car window, David, or rather, the newborn consciousness inhabiting him, scanned the smoke and wreckage as if it were a map of opportunity. In this universe, what was more famous and powerful than Superman? If the template finished integrating, another template would unlock. The calculation was simple and cold. Opportunity. "What is it?" Martha asked. Jonathan didn't answer. He'd noticed a dark, indistinct shape in the swirling dust, and it drew him out of the truck. "Martha, stay with the baby in the car. Don't get out," he ordered, then climbed down to inspect the blast site alone. Small sparks still smoldered on the ground like devil fire. He rounded the crater and stopped dead. "Martha? Jonathan? What is it?" she called twice from the cab. When he didn't answer, concern pushed her out of the truck. She hurried across the churned soil with the child still cradled to her chest. She froze beside him. Where the meteor had torn through the road, it had revealed something else. A dark, smooth craft half buried in the earth, like a tiny cradle of some unknown metal. About the size of a pickup cab, it had a transparent hatch already open. Inside, a small, curly-haired infant with startling blue eyes sat and kicked his legs, smiling at the strange new world as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Let's get out of here," Jonathan said at last, his voice tight. "The military will be here soon. This would be locked down. Questions would be asked." He didn't want their family dragged into whatever official net would follow an alien landing. "Leave?" Martha stared at the tiny, bewildered occupant of the capsule. Her hands tightened on her baby as a new, unwilled thought rose in her. She could not leave him here. He sent us more than one angel. Martha, Jonathan said, incredulous. Think about what the military would do to that child when they arrive. She knew exactly what he meant. A child taken into sterile confinement, stripped of parental care and toys, raised under the clinical, curious gaze of soldiers and scientists. No hugs, no bedtime stories, only tests and samples. The image twisted her stomach. Don't say any more, Jonathan muttered, rubbing his forehead. They were both kind people. Neither wanted that fate to fall on any child. But there was also the practical world, and the consequences of sheltering an extra unknown infant. Then the baby in Martha's arms stretched a chubby, swaddled arm toward the child in the capsule, waving with an honest, infantile enthusiasm, and let out a delighted, breathy laugh. He looked at the little alien as if at a playmate. "See, Jonathan?" Martha's face lit up. "Our boy likes him. He's telling us to take him." Jonathan hesitated, then let out a resigned laugh. 2 votes to 1, he said with mock exasperation. He kissed his wife suddenly and gently, tears of bewildered joy in his expression. He looked first at their lively newborn, then at the lonely child inside the spaceship, and sighed. "All right. What can I say? 2 children. The farm will be busy next year." Chapter 2, A Touch of Thanos' Original Flavor. "Breakfast is ready, David," his mother's voice called up from downstairs. "You and Clark will be late for school." "Coming, Mom." The golden morning sun poured through the window. David, freshly washed, traded his pajamas for clothes. Short, dark hair framed a face with strong, well-defined features. His tall, lean body hinted at the muscles beneath his shirt. A calm, statuesque presence, like an ancient Greek sculpture standing silently. "Too bad." He crossed to the mirror and clenched his hand. Bones and muscles, stronger than high-density alloy, tensed around his fist. A terrifying force, like stored volcanic energy, surged through him. His skin flushed quickly to purple and hard, ridge-like lines carved across his chin like ravines. He stared at his reflection like a silent king. The Thanos fusion template keeps progressing, but the skin discoloration still flares when I push myself too hard. A small HUD readout flickered in his mind. Template fusion progress, 81%. When he relaxed, the purple faded. He shrugged on his clothes and went downstairs, a trace of frustration in his expression. Is it supposed to keep some original flavor so I know I'm fusing with the Thanos template? At least he hadn't sprouted to 2 meters 67 and become a bald, purple, beady-eyed giant like Thanos. Thankfully, he still had hair. David touched his head and sighed inwardly. He was still in high school. He didn't want that kind of intimidating look. A sharp ding came from the toaster downstairs. The smell of toasted bread floated up as light footsteps pattered behind him. "Morning, David." Clark, taller and broader, with striking sapphire eyes, padded into the living room. He opened the fridge on a whim, and without thinking, took a large glass bottle of milk and drank straight from it. David raised an eyebrow and moved to the table. "You don't drink it like that, Clark," David said. Their mother, Martha, quickly stepped in and snatched the bottle with a small scolding. The 17 or 18-year-old, who would one day be known as Superman, grinned sheepishly. "Milk tastes better right from the fridge," he said, holding his hands up. "Where's our family's upbringing, Clark?" Martha had just finished preparing breakfast. Over the years, a few lines had creased the corners of her eyes. "Hurry up and sit down, David, or you'll miss the school bus." "Morning, sleepyheads." Jonathan came in, smelling of hay, having just finished with the cows. He shrugged his hay-dusted coat over the sofa and took the milk from Martha, taking 2 long gulps, imitating Clark's earlier behavior. "I know exactly where your upbringing went," he joked. David took the bottle from his father more calmly, poured a glass, and bit into warm toast. A stray piece of hay clung to the living room sofa. "Next time I'll remember to pat myself off outside after I feed the cows," Jonathan added, a little embarrassed. He sat at the table, cleared his throat, and tried to sound serious. Seriously, maybe that fabric sofa wasn't the smartest choice for a farm. "In this Kent household, at least someone cares about furniture," Martha said, smiling as she patted David's shoulder. Clark buried his face in his hand in mock shame. Born and raised on a farm, he and their father often ignored small domestic details. David, by contrast, was meticulous. A flash of information, an internal readout, something David had learned to ignore, floated past his vision, but he didn't flinch. He'd fused with the Thanos template faster because of growing up with Clark, who was essentially a walking reservoir of power. For the Kents, David had been the first child they found and adopted. But the son of Krypton had traveled through the cosmos before arriving on Earth, which made him appear older, despite David having arrived as a newborn. So Clark had become the elder brother and David the younger son. "What are you looking at, Clark?" David asked when he noticed his brother staring absent-mindedly at a slip of paper. Martha saw the note too and smiled. "A permission slip?" Clark flushed and fumbled to hide it. "Permission slip for what?" "For tryouts this afternoon, the school football team." At the mention of tryouts, the table fell quiet. Only David continued eating, unbothered. Jonathan and Martha exchanged a worried look. Jonathan had been a football player once himself. "You were different back then, Clark," Jonathan said carefully. "We all know that. When Clark was a child, only 7 years old, he'd been repairing a farm vehicle when a jack slipped and the car began to fall. The boy's strength had been terrifying and obvious. He'd lifted the car like it was a toy. Jonathan had been petrified. What neither of them remembered then was that David had been on the other side of that same car, his own strength just as effortless. To both of them, those heavy weights had felt light. "On the field, I'll hold back," Clark promised earnestly, trying to calm them. "I'll be careful. I can control it." David, amused, feigned confusion. "I don't quite understand, dear brother. What exactly do you hope to experience by joining the football team?" American football was a brutal physical sport, constant running, heavy collisions. To Clark, it meant learning to temper his strength, to risk hurting others while playing. Jonathan's fatherly worry came from experience. What if an accident happens? Martha fretted. "As always," Clark sighed. Hearing the familiar chorus of what-ifs, he slumped a little. "I'm tired of hiding, of sitting on the sidelines and reading while everyone else gets to do things. I want to try. I want to be like everyone else." The plea hung in the air. Clark's frustration was palpable. He wanted normal teenage experiences, team camaraderie, the rush of competition, not to be boxed in by fear of what he could do. David chewed thoughtfully, watching his brother. The Thanos template under his skin was still a variable, power and restraint in a strange balance, and he understood both sides of the argument. He didn't say anything. For now, the family's love and worry circled the same truth. Extraordinary strength made ordinary choices complicated. Thanks to everyone for collecting and following. I'm rushing to sort out the plot, and once the contract is signed, I'll start updating twice a day. 3. 17 years old. Scared Clark suddenly poured out the feelings he'd been holding in for so long, and the words left their parents at a loss for how to comfort him. "Son." This had been a shadow in their house for years. They'd always hoped he could stay hidden, that a day would never come when government agents would knock on their door and take him away. But teenagers want to be seen. They crave attention at school. His parents had been young once too. They understood that. "I'm done eating. I'm leaving," Clark said, and walked off. The dinner table grew heavy with silence. David, who'd heard the same arguments before and never liked dwelling on them, drifted toward the window, ears alert. He stood, grabbed his school bag, and left as if nothing had happened. In his head, a line of status text blinked. From Clark, excitement +9, depression 7. That extra wave of emotional points came courtesy of his dear brother. David snorted, stepped outside the Kent farm, and just in time the school bus pulled up. "Hi, David," a chorus of voices greeted as he climbed aboard. The bus was full of the usual high school noise, laughter, chatter, the bright energy of teenagers. A few people nodded his way. He acknowledged them and took a seat in the back. He watched the world slide past the window, a clear blue sky, cottony clouds, grass rolling to the distant tree line. Smallville's only real advantage was its isolation, beautiful, preserved nature and fresh air. The bus lurched forward. "Where's Clark?" asked a clear, lively voice from across the aisle. He didn't bother turning. "In the back," he said, already knowing who'd asked. Chloe, with her short blonde hair and freckled smile, peeked toward the Kent farm like a reporter sniffing out a story. She was the chief editor of the school paper and loved digging into anything odd. "It's just a typical puberty fight," David replied, with a trace of boredom. "You wouldn't be interested." "You and your lordly detachment," Chloe teased. Pietro, shorter, quick-witted, and sitting next to her, grinned and ribbed David. Real charm killer, that. Girls don't like brooding types. To the rest of the school, the Kent brothers were known for being withdrawn. Clark looked like a strong, silent type, tall, powerful, awkward with words. David's image was quieter still, a bookish, solitary figure with a slightly mysterious air. They weren't the kind to chase clubs or parties. "Looks like Clark won't make the bus today," Chloe said, half joking. "Honestly, if he weren't from a farm, people would have spread a rumor long ago that you were born in the Renaissance and live alone in a castle, like a vampire," Chloe continued, laughing. David and Chloe knew each other because they were both close to Clark. David watched the front of the bus where a familiar couple was talking and laughing. Lana Lang, smooth black hair, a slightly upturned nose, the cheer captain, and Whitney, her handsome blonde boyfriend and the star quarterback. They had the sort of polished, enviable connection that made teenagers' stomachs twist with longing. "If Shy Clark could take Lana away from Whitney," David muttered, "the torch would have its headline for sure." Chloe snorted. "You know that's not going to happen." Everyone had noticed Clark zoning out whenever Lana was around. He blushed, stammered, and got flustered. Classic signs. Even if he tried to hide it, those who paid attention saw it. As a brother who'd been around for more than a decade, David would back Clark if Clark genuinely cared for football. "Too bad our young Superman is blinded by hormones," David added, dryly. Pietro leaned closer, a hint of concern in his voice. "David, what about you?" "I already said I'm not joining the football team," David replied flatly. He had no interest in playing a game dominated by arrogant jocks who treated strength like a contest. "It's the only way," Pietro whispered, almost afraid to be overheard. "What way?" Chloe asked. "Why are you talking so low, Pietro?" He glanced at the boisterous football players near the front as if they might suddenly turn. "You wouldn't understand, Chloe." "You're a girl. That's not true," she shot back. Pietro swallowed nervously. "There's a tradition on the team. Before a big game, they paint an S for Smallville on someone's chest and hang them up like a scarecrow." David let out a short, bitter laugh. "A morale thing. Boys being barbaric." Chloe's face cooled. "That's sick. That's why Clark and I thought about joining, to be on good terms with the team. Even if we only helped with gear, handed out water, they wouldn't mess with one of their own," Pietro said. He looked at David like he wanted to warn him. "If Clark doesn't make it onto the team, you or your brother could be the target." This wasn't idle gossip. High schools often elevated athletes to untouchable status. Brainy kids, no matter how stellar academically, were the ones who got pushed around. Two farm boys with good grades stood out. And if Whitney figures Clark searching for Lana, Pietro trailed off, making the implication clear. David rolled his eyes. Clark thought he'd been subtle about his crush, but anyone paying attention could see. To the outside world, Clark's awkwardness made him look unthreatening, but his tall frame and plain good looks made other guys uneasy. Lana, even with a boyfriend, treated Clark a little differently sometimes, and that didn't help Whitney's temper. Pietro kept whispering, trying to persuade David to sign up for the football team as a preemptive move. Whitney, laughing with Lana, glanced back at them once, a casual, assessive look with a trace of chill. For a second, it lingered on David, as if he were a piece on a checkerboard. David raised an eyebrow. Was he supposed to be afraid now? He glanced at his own reflection in the window. 17 years old, built like a small mountain. 17, he thought wryly, with the physique of a comic book titan. Am I scared of a little school roughhousing? Clark's parents still hadn't agreed to let him try out for the football team. He slung his backpack on, dejected, and glanced back at the dirt road in front of the farm. Tire tracks cut through the dust. The bus was probably already halfway to town. I can't show anything strange in front of people, he told himself, but as long as no one sees me, it's fine. He smiled, then vanished from the yard in a blur, rushing into the cornfield at a speed that left a gust of wind in his wake. From above, the green rose split apart as if by a hand. The bus, however, had been delayed only briefly by a broken-down car and a short conversation with its driver. It still arrived at Smallville High on time. Students streamed off and into the campus under the blooming cherry trees. David lingered at the top of the bus steps and glanced at a faded, weathered sign by the highway. Welcome to Smallville, the meteorite capital of the world. 10 years earlier, a shower of meteorites had struck the area. Meteorites that everyone now knew were pieces of the son of Krypton's crashed spaceship. Kryptonite, the town called it, a single green stone that could make a god fall to his knees. The town had tried to turn disaster into a tourist gimmick, but the main street still took only a few steps to cross, and the buildings were low and sparse. David slipped his hands into his pockets and walked onto campus. The meteorite capital, he muttered. Clark's got a lot to worry about. Chloe and Pietro hopped down and caught up with him. Clark, wearing jeans and a thick blue plaid shirt and pretending he had simply arrived early, stepped out of nowhere with a stack of books and waved. Morning, Chloe, Pietro. Chloe's weirdness radar went off. He'd missed the bus, so how was he already here? I took a shortcut, Clark said, casual. Left early. David didn't see me. David had seen one sentence from that morning ruin Clark's plan, a reminder that his parents hadn't agreed to let him try out. Clark rubbed his brother's shoulders in a jokingly affectionate way. He'd never been secretly proud or resentful about his speed and strength in front of their family. Still, when others didn't see what he was, he worried. David, who lived with him and knew, didn't give him away. That steadied him. Then, with no warning, Clark's legs gave out. Weakness hit him like a wave. He dropped his books and collapsed to the ground. Whitney and his girlfriend Lana were walking by. Whitney cast a disdainful glance, but Lana bent to help pick up Clark's scattered books. Around her neck hung a small green crystal. Thus spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche? Lana teased, holding up one of the books. Clark, do you think you're ordinary? Or a Superman? She asked with a smile. Clark looked away, breathless and embarrassed. I don't know, he stammered. David, glancing at Lana's green pendant, didn't need to ask. Kryptonite. The green stone robbed Clark of energy and composure. For all the symbolic overtones about Nietzsche and the Übermensch, it was simpler. When kryptonite was around, Clark was vulnerable. David rubbed his chin, half amused and half sympathetic. He had toyed with the idea of carrying a piece of kryptonite as a joke of his own, but seeing Clark's crush caught off guard by a necklace made him rethink that plan. Let's go, David said, shaking his head as if to brush off the moment. He had little patience for theatrics. Whitney, jealous to see his girlfriend talking to Clark, did nothing in front of Lana except give a brief, possessive kiss and walk off. Clark glared at his brother when David left without helping. How pathetic, Clark, David called back over his shoulder, and the line stung more than a shove. They headed into the building. Hallways filled with teenagers trading flirtations and declarations. Spring was here, and with it the spring dance. Chloe blinked at David. Got a partner yet? Never been interested, David said, shrugging. How about you be my friend partner, Chloe? Pietro offered, grinning. Clark said nothing. By noon, the bell released them. Clark stopped David with an overly serious tone. David, you're going home today. I'm going to the field with Pietro, Clark lied smoothly. I'll cheer him on. David scanned him up and down and snorted. I'm too embarrassed to expose you, Clark, he said, slipping his hands into his pockets and walking away. On the bus, David watched the town slide by. He knew Clark's real reason, watching Lana and the cheerleaders across the field, and thought it was asking for trouble. Chloe sat beside him, scribbling an opinion piece for the school paper, titled Football, Sport or Barbarism, on the cover of her backpack. Pietro dozed. The driver kept a steady pace across the bridge. Nobody saw the strip of twisted, broken metal lying in the middle of the road where the earlier car had been abandoned. A tire hit it with a loud bang. The bus shrieked as a wheel blew out. The driver fought the wheel. The bus fishtailed, careened, and smashed through the bridge railing. For a heartbeat, everything went weightless. Students screamed as the bus plunged into the river below and slammed into the water with a thunderous splash. The 10-ton vehicle began to sink. Cold river water poured through cracks and broken windows, rising fast. Help! Somebody help! People shouted and pounded at the glass. Chloe's face went white. She couldn't swim and was terrified. I don't want to die. Can anyone save me? Panic spread. The interior filled with shouts, gurgling water, the frantic sound of hands scrabbling for anything solid. Through the chaos, David stood up in ankle-deep water, clothes soaked, but his expression oddly composed. He frowned and looked around as if weighing the situation, not hysterical, not paralyzed, just focused. "Unlucky," he said under his breath. "Clark, you saved Luther?" Time seemed to slow to a crawl. For a moment everything, ripples on the floodwater inside the school bus, the girl's hair whipped by the current, the boy's frantic shouts spitting droplets into the air, the plastic cups floating on the surface, moved 100 times more slowly. David watched it all with the calm of someone who already knew the ending. He reached out, smashed the nearest window with a single, precise blow, swept his arms, and launched himself like a torpedo. The front of the bus loomed high above him. Inside, the students panicked and shouted, completely oblivious. Submerged in the river, David didn't even bother to hold his breath. His expression was relaxed. Like Thanos, with an Eternal's physique, he didn't need to eat, drink, or even breathe. He could survive the void of space at 200 degrees below zero. Water was nothing to him. He pressed his hand against the bus's nose and, with what looked like casual effort, shoved. The 10-ton vehicle, as if struck by an explosion, rocketed backward through the surge, broke the water, and with a thunderous splash, hurtled toward the bank. The bus arced through the air for more than 10 meters and slammed down onto the grassy shore. Tires gouged mud. The impact made the whole frame bounce. Windows shattered. Glass sprayed like glitter. Screams cut off mid-phrase as everyone pitched forward and then fell back, clutching their heads. For a long while, no one could speak. They had been at the bottom of a dark, roaring river a heartbeat ago. Now they sat on a sunlit bank with birds chirping in the trees and the world oddly bright. Are we dreaming?" one girl whispered. Faces stared at one another in stunned disbelief. The bus driver, a devout man who had clutched his hat until now, snatched it off and stared down toward the water as though expecting angels to rise from it. "Are you all right, Chloe?" Chloe, pale and shivering, turned. David stood beside her, soaked through but composed. No terror showed on his carved features. Chloe's knees still felt weak. After brushing so close to death, she couldn't quite grasp the miracle. I'm okay," she said, voice tremulous. "When I went under, I thought the next time we saw light, we'd be hauled out in body bags." "Who did it?" came the inevitable question. Who had pulled the bus clear of the river? Who had saved them? A few people, staring open-mouthed, whispered that God had answered prayers. "We should get the bus away from the water," the driver finally said, voice shaking. The bank was slick. If the bus slid back, it would be a disaster. David wrung water from his clothes and stepped away from the vehicle along with the others. The driver craned his neck to examine the bus's dented nose, which looked as if an elephant had taken a direct hit. "Did something under the water hit us out?" he asked aloud. "Like a water monster?" a student suggested, equal parts terrified and excited. Others exchanged theories, a giant river creature, a submerged beast that had flung them ashore. They peered into the churning current, imagining a hulking shadow beneath the surface. David casually glanced at the marks he'd left and then looked away. The truth was stranger. He was an eternal-born mutant. His strength and endurance were beyond ordinary reckoning, his recovery and agility far superior to humans. His skin resisted cold, heat, electricity, radiation, poison, aging, and disease. His raw power could rival vibranium, and if he pushed too hard, he could crush the fragile bodies around him. "I've only integrated about 80% of the template so far," he thought. He didn't know the true ceiling of what he could do. To him, pickup trucks and boulders felt light. He could imagine catching falling planes, towing battleships, even lifting multi-story buildings. Without a versatile biological field, though, such feats risked tearing things apart. At the riverbed, he had deliberately held back. He hadn't wanted to squeeze the bus free with too much force and risk turning suffocating kids into corpses. Now everyone moved away from the bank and sat on the grass, waiting for ambulances and for terrified parents to arrive. There were injuries, bruises, broken bones, cuts from shattered glass, but alive. The spectacle of a bus plunging into a river and being inexplicably hurled onto shore by an unseen force would have puzzled scientists. In this town, however, it barely cracked anyone's worldview. Strange things had been happening here since the meteor showers over a decade ago. comatose people waking and vanishing, enormous wolves prowling the woods, a lone girl in a cemetery dissolving into the darkness, creatures with inhuman speed tearing at the mountains in the night. When word spread that their children had been in a near drowning, parents rushed in fear and relief. David's mother, Martha, drove up in the family pickup and came running. She checked him from head to toe, voice taut with worry. "Are you all right? Your legs? Your chest? Did you choke?" "I'm fine, Mom," he said, smiling to calm her. He took her cold, trembling hands in his. "Where's Dad? Why did you come so fast?" "The police called," Martha said, still breathless. "Your brother was in a car accident on another bridge. He fell into the river. Your father went to see him." David's heart lurched. Of all days, both his sons had been in river accidents on the same afternoon, one the school bus, the other a car into a river. "Who was driving?" he asked, immediately flipping into practical mode. "Is the driver hurt? Are we going to have to pay for anything?" Martha's face had that particular combination of worry and bewilderment mothers get when their sons are involved in impossible things. Clark is your brother David," she said gently. "I know, but a truck hitting him." David spread his hands. Even if Clark had been battered, as long as he wasn't dead, some sun and rest would fix him. He tried to show Martha he was calm, then dusted himself off. "See you this afternoon, Chloe," he told the girl, and gave his mother a quick hug before they climbed into the old pickup that had belonged to the Kents for over 10 years. As he walked away, Chloe, wrapped in a rescue blanket and still shivering, noticed a footprint in the mud a short distance from the bus. Beneath it, a patch of fresh river grass was crushed and green. She looked around, puzzled. No one had broken free of the bus windows before it landed. Who had stepped out there? Only the injured and the theatrically hurt were left. The rest had returned to class by the next day. David couldn't help but be amused at how tough and adaptable the town's people were. 10 years after the meteorites, they took miracles in stride. Dusk the next day found David and Clark walking home from school. At the entrance to their little farmyard, a brand new red pickup sat parked like a present, fresh paint catching the last light of the sun, a ribbon still tied to the grill. Clark walked up, eyes wide. "Is that for us?" he asked, smiling. "Are we finally getting a new car?" Martha, just back from the barn, wiped her hands and handed Clark an envelope with a tight smile. "This is for you, Clark." "For me?" Clark beamed, already imagining pulling up to school in it. "Why?" Martha pushed the note into his hands. "You saved someone. He sent the truck." She hesitated, then added, as if the name might explain everything. "He signed it. Lex Luthor." Clark tore open the thank you letter. He'd been the one who'd been knocked off the bridge by a silver sports car and had found himself in the river, but he'd come out of it fine. And the man whose car he'd pulled clear had been stunned by Clark's strength. The letter read in part, "Dear Clark, drive carefully, don't be like me," and ended with, "Thank you so much for yesterday, Lex Luthor." Clark began to imagine how he'd cruise the county roads, how Lana might finally notice him. David, who hadn't paid attention until he heard the name, looked at the letter and felt his eyebrows climb. "Wait a minute. Clark, you saved Lex Luthor?" Clark looked at him, puzzled by the surprise. "Yes. Why?" Chapter 6. Son, it's time. Lex Luthor would be one of Superman's lifelong enemies. Ever since he first encountered the man the world would call Superman, Lex committed himself to removing what he saw as a threat. In his view, Superman had wrapped humanity in a soft cradle of comfort, preventing people from facing real crises and so stunting mankind's growth. Yesterday, a young Lex Luthor had nearly drowned in a river. He would almost certainly have died if someone hadn't pulled him out. Clark had done it. Clark had saved one of his greatest future enemies. "Clark, as long as you're happy," David said, shrugging. "Of course I'm happy," Clark answered with a small smile. Then, turning to his mother, he added, "Mom, where are the keys to this car? Do you want to go for a drive with me, David?" He brightened at the idea. Their newly acquired truck was the first car he'd ever seen as possibly his. Given their finances, Clark had assumed he'd have to wait until he was working to have a car of his own. Martha hesitated. "The keys are with your father." Rumbling machinery drowned out the rest. Beside the hay baler, Jonathan was bent over his work, keeping the farm running. Clark hurried over, eager to ask for the keys. Before he could, Jonathan shut the bailer down, his face hardening. I know you want it, Jonathan said, but you can't accept it. Clark frowned. Why? I saved him. That doesn't mean you can accept expensive gifts because someone owes you a favor, Jonathan replied. That truck's for you, Clark. I can keep the old one. That's not the point, Jonathan said quickly, noticing Clark's disappointment. The Luthers, Lex Luthor, those people could buy and sell this town. A pickup truck is nothing to them. David, arms in his pockets, gave Clark a look that said he agreed. The Luthor Group was a worldwide conglomerate. Even Smallville's economy depended on the Luthor's fertilizer plant. To an heir of that family, a truck was pocket change. Son, Jonathan continued more gently, you have to understand. In life, we don't always get everything we want. That's normal. I'm sick of normal, Clark snapped. The strain of pretending had been building for days, weeks, years, being careful, small, invisible. He could do so much. He could lift and fix and save and change, and yet he was forced into being ordinary. He pictured himself on the school playground, standing on the sidelines while the girl he loved was in someone else's arms. He had to watch, silent and helpless. The injustice of it finally broke something inside him. He dodged his father's reaching hand and stalked back to the silenced bailer. In a sudden, reckless motion, he reached into the mechanism while it was still idling and thrust his arm into the spinning blades. Clank! Clank! The bailer's blades shuddered as if striking an unbreakable alloy. Teeth chipped, gears cracked, and a plume of black smoke belched from the machine as it coughed and died. Clark! Jonathan shouted, racing over. Even though he knew his son's body was not entirely human, steel bones and other impossible things, his heart hammered at the sight. He hauled Clark's arm free. Clark's clothes were shredded, but his skin was unmarked. You're strong, Clark, Jonathan said, panting. But do you ever think about money? Repairing that bailer isn't cheap. David looked at Clark and said flatly, See, I told you, I'm abnormal. It's who I am. Clark's temper flared again, words tumbling out. Martha came running when she heard the crash, exchanging a frightened look with her husband. She knew, had long suspected, there were things they couldn't keep from Clark forever. Maybe, it's time, son, she said. Jonathan sighed and took off his gloves slowly. This day was always going to come. What? Clark felt the chill of a premonition. Jonathan put a hand on his shoulder and led him away from the yard. Come with me, he said. Then, after a pause, he looked back at David. You too. You're part of this family. You have the right to know the truth. Though David was their biological son and Clark had been found as an infant, Jonathan and Martha had never shown favorites. Both boys were their sons. Clark, Jonathan went on quietly, you were born different. You have strength beyond human imagining. The town's dilapidated auto shop thumped with loud rock music. A heavy-set, gum-chewing mechanic leaned over a car, reached in, and turned a key. The dashboard lights blinked, and the engine growled to life. He slammed the lid of the hood shut and grinned, then noticed a thin shadow standing in the doorway. Jesus, don't sneak up on me like that, he snapped. The shadow didn't move. The mechanic squinted. There was something familiar about the pallid, hollow-cheeked kid under the shop's awning. Hey, don't I know you? You look like that scarecrow or something. Jerome, right? Jerome stood under the dim light. Black hair, too thin frame, cheeks hollow like a skull. He said nothing. The mechanic kept talking, wiping his greasy hand on Jerome's jacket in a gesture of contempt. Heard you were in that meteor shower. Came out of it in a coma. Finally stopped milking it for attention, huh? Look at you. What a joke. At the touch, Jerome's shoulder flared. A crackle of electricity roared through the mechanic's hand. The air filled with the sharp smell of burnt skin. He was thrown backward, crashing into a tool rack and scattering wrenches across the concrete. Monster, the man cried, clutching his scorched palm, his face white with pain. Realization and fear dawned on him. He had come looking to humiliate Jerome, and now he was the one screaming. It was just a game. It was just... Jerome's voice was low and deadly calm. A game? Chapter 7. I'll bring Clark back. A game? Jerome laughed, as if hearing a joke, and held up his hand. A horrendous scar ran across his palm, where a steel nail had once been driven in. After Jesus was nailed to the cross, he took on the world's sins and rose to heaven, he intoned. Sizzle. As he spoke, his palm crackled with a blinding, violent electric current. The worker's eyes widened in terror. 17 years later, I came back to the human world, and God gave me this power to cleanse your sins. Since you love games so much, let's play one more." Jerome stepped forward like the personification of death. The light from the electricity threw a cruel glare across the window as chilling screams cut the night. 10 minutes later, a thin figure in a hood slipped away without a sound. Inside the auto repair shop, a body lay on the floor, tortured, charred by electricity, a blackened husk. Pride and contempt were gone. The corpse had curled into itself like an infant returning to the dark. Click, click. Jonathan pulled open the barn door. The smell of old rot and damp hay drifted out. David already knew how this night would end. He rarely dropped his casual expression, but beside him, Clark stood bewildered, and a flicker of worry ran through David. He wasn't sure Clark could take the truth. Because of David's existence, and because Clark had been found as an infant, Jonathan and Martha had no way to explain adopting another child openly. They had claimed to outsiders that the two boys were brothers. "What are you saying, Father?" Clark's voice trembled. Panic had him by the throat, and he regretted lashing out at his parents earlier. Of course, Mom and Dad were trying to protect him. He knew, and yet the revelation felt like a betrayal. Why hadn't he controlled himself? "These are things your parents left you, Clark." Jonathan pulled an item from an unremarkable old box. His face trembled with sadness as he handed it to Clark. It was a long, dark, stone-like seal with an S embossed on the head. "Parents?" Clark stared at it, pale. He dared not touch the cold object, as if a single brush would shatter something delicate and irreversible. "Father, this isn't funny." Why did he believe his father and not feel his heart racing? David stepped back, frowning at the seal. He worried what this would do to Clark. For ordinary people, finding out in one day that the people who raised you aren't your biological parents is a blow hard to bear. If he learns he's an alien, David remembered something a pale, deranged man once said: "All it takes is one bad day." The thought of a Joker-made Superman made his eyelids twitch. Jonathan opened the cellar door and led the boys down. He pulled back a dusty tarp. Underneath sat a small spacecraft, the classic cradle-shaped pod, streamlined and just large enough for an infant. It shouldn't have been on a Kansas farm. No. Clark staggered back as if struck. "Father, don't do this to me." He looked like a child abandoned at a doorstep, pleading. Jonathan's expression was heavy with the pain of what he'd done, but he had to finish what he'd started. "Clark, Martha and I adopted you." When Clark clutched at the possibility of a lie, Jonathan forced himself onward. Long pain was worse than a quick sting. He had to get it out. "You're from outer space. We found you in that meteor shower more than 10 years ago." Clark's head swam. The world tilted and everything seemed to slip away. "What about David?" He grabbed for the only anchor he had left. "Please don't tell him." "David is Martha and my biological son," Jonathan said, and watched Clark's face unravel. David's expression held almost no surprise. Jonathan mistook it for disbelief and felt a flash of irritation he had no time for. For the first time he hesitated, then forced the last cruel detail out. Clark's denial turned sudden and fierce. "No, no," Clark roared, teeth bared like a wounded animal. Blood rose to his eyes. He spun and ran, desperate to escape the lie, the grief, the identity that had been ripped away. With a speed far beyond anything human, Clark shot upward out of the cellar and vanished from sight. "Son!" Jonathan called, reaching for him, but he was only a mortal father and could not begin to follow his son of Krypton. He stood at the barn door, powerless as the night, his heart empty. "Clark will figure it out, Father." David moved to steady Jonathan, feeling oddly moved by the sight of the stubborn man at his most fragile. He'd never seen Jonathan so undone. "I don't believe he'll abandon our family." David squeezed his father's shoulder. Jonathan turned and glanced at him, exhausted. "Why aren't you surprised?" "We only have a few acres," Jonathan said hoarsely. "Clark's always been different." David himself had never understood how Clark hadn't found the spaceship years ago. He had been a curious child, always exploring, always climbing, and he'd snuck into the barn as a small boy to investigate. Yet the pod had remained hidden. Jonathan sank to the cellar steps as if the years had suddenly shone on him all at once, and then, in a hoarse voice, he spoke a rare praise. "David, my son, you've been very good." David looked down at his father, who had always been tough and inflexible. and felt something like gratitude and pity. Where Clark came from, whether he's an alien or not, doesn't change that he's family. He's the brother who grew up with you. Don't blame him for reacting like this. He just can't accept it yet. I'll go find him. David stood and squared his shoulders. He could see his father drifting into worry and rambling. Action was better. Jonathan cut in and warned, if Clark won't come back right away, don't force him. David nodded. He promised aloud, but in his head a different plan formed. If he couldn't win Clark back with words, he thought wryly, maybe Clark would respond to a good, face-correcting punch to bring him down to earth. He started for the door. Clark stumbled into the bar like a ghost, the neon lights and blasting music sliding past him in a blur. He'd run away from home and wanted nothing more than to drink until he couldn't think. The bartender frowned at his ID. You're only 18. State law. No hard liquor. Beer, Clark said. Anything. He pushed the card back across the counter and sat at the dim end of the bar, watching the crowd. People danced and shouted, others hunched over booths playing drinking games. The laughter and heat of the room made him feel even more alone, like a wolf torn from its pack. A hollow, nameless ache sat under his ribs. Everything felt unreal. He replayed his father's words the way a mind torments itself. He didn't belong to this family, not even to this planet. As a child, he'd wondered why other kids couldn't lift cars, why falling a few stories hurt them, why his parents and brother seemed so different. The answer, cold and blunt, had been handed to him that afternoon. He pictured his mother's careful apple pies, the bickering with his brother on the bus, the morning chores with his father. All of it could be a lie. For a second, he wanted to smash something, to tear the world apart, and find out why he had been given a life that wasn't his. He looked down at his driver's license, Clark Kent, at the neat, ordinary name. It should have been strange and unpronounceable, not this comfortable human label. Of the billions on Earth, none of them were his. None of this was home. Why? A hand clapped him on the shoulder. It really is you. Whitney and several football players closed in, beers in hand, grins like hunting dogs. Whitney slung an arm over Clark's shoulders with a show of familiarity, squeezing just enough to make the gesture feel like a threat. Clark, what are you doing drinking alone? Don't bother me, Clark muttered. Whitney's grip tightened. Clark, who normally would have flinched under the pressure, felt uselessly rigid. His body felt stubborn and numb. He forced himself not to lash out. Jonathan and Martha had spent years teaching him restraint. He clung to that training now, even as a hot, furious impulse rose in him. Whitney sneered. Good news for you, Kent. This year's scarecrow is going to be you. His teammates laughed. Whitney's beer sloshed as he shoved Clark by the shoulder. Humiliated, Whitney wanted to make the young man suffer for being soft. Is that why you stare at my girlfriend? Whitney said low, hateful. His hand found the green pendant at his own throat, the meteorite crystal he'd been wearing since Lana gave it to her boyfriend. You jealous? You want it so bad? Whitney yanked the necklace off and with a cruel smirk hung it around Clark's neck. It was colder than metal and pulsed with a faint, wrong light. The instant the chain touched his skin, Clark felt something thin and poisonous slide through him. Ah! He choked as his strength drained. His vision swam. The hand closest to the pendant throbbed with shocks that felt like tiny green veins pulsing under the skin. He had felt kryptonite once before. He knew the sound of his power bleeding away. Whitney shoved him. Take him out. They meant to drag him through the back and shove him into a cornfield, to make an example of him. Clark tried to fight, but his legs gave out. Stabs of pain ran up his spine. He barely managed to shout when a figure in a brown jacket stepped into the crowd. Where are you taking Clark, Whitney? The newcomer asked, hands in his pockets, voice almost flat. David? Whitney blinked, then laughed. Perfect. We'll take you with us too. Clark's pulse quickened when he saw his brother. David's face was unreadable. He didn't look shocked or worried, only there, as if this had been expected. Clark tried to warn him through the haze. You can't. Whitney nudged two teammates forward. Show him what happens to people who think they can get with Lana. The two hit from either side like wolves. The noise in the bar swelled. People love a fight. But David didn't move the way a frightened kid would. He sidestepped the first punch with a loose, almost bored roll and replied with a quick, brutal blow. The football player doubled over, winded, eyes widening. The second attacker swung. David flowed into him and drove an elbow so sharp the man's head hit the floor with a sick thud. 2 seconds, 2 men on the ground, groaning. The bar went quiet for a breath, then applause and whistles broke out. Whitney's face collapsed into disbelief. "You, what are you?" David didn't gloat. He was efficient, light footwork, precise hits. The 3 who charged him couldn't land more than grazes. He knocked them down one by one with the kind of effortless, practiced movements that made it clear he wasn't just a brawler. Whitney scrambled up, clutching his ribs, firing anger and embarrassment at his teammates. He lunged again, and David, without wasting a second, kicked him aside as if closing a door on a bothersome child. "If you use too much force, you show what you really are," David said quietly as he approached Clark. "Against these guys, you don't need to be superhuman." The rest of the bar opened a path like parting curtains. People muttered, some admiration, some fear. One voice whispered, "Where'd he learn that, Navy SEAL or something?" Clark tried to sit up and found his strength returning enough to breathe. He watched David reach up, unfasten the pendant from his neck, and slide it into his pocket. The glow that had been sucking at him dimmed and fell away. His head cleared. His knees stopped trembling. He let out a shuddering breath and then passed out, relief overwhelming the pain. David looked over his shoulder without expression, and then with a little more softness, he picked Clark up as if he weighed nothing and turned toward the door. The crowd made way. Whitney spat curses that died on the air. No one wanted to be in the path of whatever David might do next. Outside, under a cold slice of moon, Clark began to come to. Hanging between awareness and sleep, he realized they were on the road that led home. He fumbled to free himself and slurred, "Put me down, David. I don't want to go back." David's voice was flat when he answered, "We can talk at home." "I can't." Clark tried, the words collapsing into a broken, choking sentence. He remembered the look on his father's face, the way the world had shifted. He'd run to forget. He couldn't face the house where everything he'd counted on had been taken from him. But in David's arms there was no mockery, no triumphant cruelty, just steady weight and the quiet certainty of a brother who never believed in making a scene. The bar faded behind them. The road slid under their feet. Clark closed his eyes and let himself be carried, the taste of iron and the echo of green light still on his tongue. After Clark and David left, Whitney and the other varsity players lay in a scattered heap, struggling to their feet. They had tried to gang up on someone and couldn't even touch his clothes. Under the jeers of the bar crowd, they helped one another up with awkward grins and slunk away. Not long after, a slender figure stepped out of the doorway, watching the group in their baseball jackets vanish down the street. Coldness hardened his eyes. No rush, plenty of time. Jerome murmured that to himself and went back inside, nursing his drink as he watched a burly man at the far corner try to hit on a girl. His face was unreadable, almost lifeless. The original plan couldn't be derailed. The town's spring dance was tomorrow night, and Jerome already imagined himself the center of attention. He sneered at the thought of being dazzling in a way that would make them all look. Meanwhile, on the dark road, Clark woke to find himself slumped over David's shoulder. He tried to peel himself up weakly. "Put me down, David. I don't want to go back." He couldn't yet figure out how to face their parents. David's voice was blunt. "What? 18-year-old Clark wants to run away from home?" David saw a simple solution rather than a long sentimental argument. He tapped Clark on the back of the neck. Clark turned, confused at the odd, light hit. "Use too little force," David muttered, then punched again. This time, the strike was heavy enough to throw the air out of Clark's lungs. The force rippled out several yards, bending the roadside weeds like a sudden wind. Clark's eyes rolled back, and he went under. Done. On the walk back to the farm, David's mood was almost casual as he carried the unconscious boy. At the porch light, he paused and took out a green, glowing kryptonite pendant. He held it close to Clark's face until the glow washed over him, tinting Clark's skin sickly pale. The faint pain returned to Clark in sleep. The kryptonite made his features slack and fragile. Satisfied, David pocketed the pendant. Kryptonians only get anywhere near mortal danger if they're exposed to kryptonite for months, even years, he told himself. A short dose would be enough for a convincing pretense. "Of course I'm doing this for your own good, Clark," he added with a smile that had nothing to do with compassion. Jonathan and Martha were on the porch, anxiously waiting. Martha gasped at the sight of David carrying Clark. "Oh my goodness, David. What happened to your brother? Clark, how did he pass out?" Jonathan's face was a mix of concern and disbelief. Clark had been a healthy, unstoppable kid since he could walk. They had never seen him pale and limp like this before. David shrugged as if it were obvious. "Not sure. Looks like his superhuman constitution had a problem." "Quick, lay him down," David said, and Jonathan carefully took Clark and laid him on the sofa. Martha went to fetch a glass of water, hands trembling. "Clark?" A groan. Clark's eyes fluttered open. His parents gathered around him instantly, faces creased with deep, unyielding worry. Seeing them, warm, familiar, made something inside him ache. He stared at the gray at his father's temples, at the lines etched into his mother's skin by years of worry and work. Memories, small, ordinary, precious, flooded him. Riding on his father's shoulders, the way Jonathan would run with him, the corn dogs his mother used to make. He had taken their youth for granted. He remembered, too, how they had found him amid a meteor shower and raised him like a son with painstaking care. They had never used him or tried to make money off his strength. All they had ever wanted was to protect him. "Mother! Father!" Clark broke into tears he didn't try to hide. He sprang up and wrapped them both in a fierce hug. "I was wrong. No matter what I am, that doesn't change that I'm your son." Relief flooded Jonathan's face and he hugged him back. "As long as you're back, Clark," he said. David, leaning in the doorway, clapped once and gave a teasing half-smile. "Looks like somebody gave up on running away." Clark, flustered and still ashamed, inwardly tallied his feelings, joy, gratitude, shame, before muttering, "You always see things more clearly than I do, David." Jonathan and Martha exchanged a fond look. Their younger son had always been observant, steady, never a worry. Martha approached Clark and studied his pallor. "Are you sure you're all right?" "I'm fine, except for the back of my head." Clark rubbed the spot reflexively and recalled the blows. David only shrugged with an odd, casual comment. "Maybe Whitney and his friends did it." "Injured? Someone hit you?" Jonathan asked, alarmed. Clark started to ask what really happened, but the conversation was interrupted as the night deepened. Later, in the big storage warehouse on the farm, up on the second floor by the open window, Clark walked his parents through what had really happened that evening. They listened, gradually calmed. The wheat fields swayed under a mild breeze. The night felt ordinary again. Clark sat at the window with the telescope, aiming it across the small town. He found Lana on the porch of her house, dark hair loose, bent over a notebook and writing an English report. There was no green pendant around her throat. Watching her there, quiet, concentrated, made something sour and sharp gather in Clark's chest. He kept looking. A figure moved stealthily along the side yard, crouched in the bushes, clicked a few pictures of Lana from behind the leaves, then slipped the camera away. The figure fumbled with something, then broke a twig on purpose, stepped out, and placed a small gift box on Lana's porch before running off. Lana came out, puzzled, and opened the box. A handful of colorful, delicate butterflies, real or artificial, fluttered out, dusted with a faint green shimmer. She covered her mouth in surprise and glanced down the street, searching for the giver. Clark felt a jolt of something like jealousy. Lana's charm had always been unsettling. He remembered a detail David had mentioned once. Someone had asked their mother for $300, saying they were very interested in astronomy. He wondered whether the person who'd been sifting through the bushes had anything to do with that. "You've been staring out here for a long time," David said, climbing the stairs to the loft. He paused behind Clark and watched the telescope. "Honestly, when I first saw you with that thing, I thought you were looking for your home among the stars, feeling lonely and sad about where you came from." He raised an eyebrow at the telescope pointed straight across the road. "But it turns out, 10, everyone is guilty. Although I'm not sure where I came from, this is unquestionably my home." Hearing David's words, Clark fell quiet. His tone was more serious than Clark had ever heard it, spoken to David, and almost to himself at the same time. "I'm absolutely sure of it, David. You, Mom, and Dad, you're my family." This will never change. After nearly losing what he had always taken for granted, Clark suddenly understood how much he needed to cherish and protect those ties. Kinship, family. Thanks for today, little brother. Don't expect a few kind words to stop me from telling Mom what you've been doing with that thing all day. Clark, usually reserved, said it plainly. David blinked, a little taken aback, and let his gaze drift away. That astronomical telescope was built so humanity could see the vast, magnificent universe, not so someone could spy on his crush and make up dreams from what he sees. David, I absolutely didn't, Clark scrambled to explain himself. I know, David cut in, but his single sentence left Clark flustered. David made a perfunctory remark and turned to leave. Anxiety +7 from Clark, embarrassment 4. Today had been unlike any other. A string of events had driven the Kents and Clark through intense emotions. David had gained emotional points, and his fusion degree nudged up a little. Template fusion degree, 81%, 80%. The further along the template, the harder it was to improve, but each point gained brought more potent power than before. A morning breeze drifted through Smallville High. Sneakers scuffed, girls whispered and giggled, and boys puffed their chests out while boasting to friends. The students wore faces full of excitement. Tonight was the spring dance. You didn't ride the bus with David again this morning, Clark? Pietro asked, curious. Something happened. I saved someone, and they gave me a gift I couldn't keep, Clark answered. I went back this morning to return it. He'd followed his father's advice, gone to the Rex estate, chatted politely with Lex Luthor, and brought back the pickup truck. What gift? Pietro pressed. That necklace is important to me. Lana's faint voice carried nearby. She looked upset. Whitney, beside her, had a bandage on his bruised nose and a red, swollen forehead. He kept trying to comfort her and explain. What happened to Whitney's face? Pietro asked, puzzled. Maybe he fell while drunk? Clark offered awkwardly, glancing at David's indifferent expression. He heard Whitney lying. Whitney and Lana's conversation had been loud enough for Clark's superhuman hearing. He frowned. That necklace was carved from a meteorite that fell when my parents died. My aunt gave it back then so I'd remember them, and someone lost it. At the bar, some drunk people caused trouble and we fought. Afterwards, the necklace was gone. Lana, I promise I'll get it back. Clark listened to the lie and to the story of Lana's necklace. His stomach tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell them the truth, to get the necklace back for Lana. He looked pleadingly toward David, opening his mouth to speak. You're really kind, Clark. David sounded faintly helpless. He had already guessed what Clark was about to say and began to walk away. Although David's hearing was far inferior to a Kryptonian's, he could still hear them clearly enough at this distance. Clark had been reluctant to give up his chance to talk to the person he liked, but he couldn't stand the thought that Lana would be comforted by a lie. Returning the necklace would heal the rift between Lana and Whitney and would probably cost him his chance too. Overly kind, truly fit to be Superman someday, David muttered, and that was all he offered. Before the dance, Clark kept pestering David for the necklace. David dealt with him superficially. What reason did he have to hand over the kryptonite he had? Still, Clark's persistence kept generating emotional points. At the dance, Chloe, uninvited, paired up with Pietro to avoid standing alone. David and Clark didn't care about that. Music filled the great hall. Couples in formal wear smiled and moved together like birds on the floor. At a long buffet table, David idly picked up a pastry and took a bite. Look, he said, using his fork to point at the center of the floor, your dream girl is dancing with another man, arm around her waist. Clark stared at the scene and felt the sourness of swallowed lemon. Though annoyed, Lana, unaware of the truth and believing Whitney's excuse, didn't refuse his invitation. Under envious looks, the two gazed into each other's eyes and danced at the center of the floor, the most dazzling pair in the room. Clark stood at the edge, invisible. That was Lana's necklace to begin with, David, Clark said, his voice edged with loss. David felt a pang of resignation and didn't want to pile pain onto the hurting boy. Fine, I'll give it to you tomorrow. Besides, David added, matter-of-factly, Lana isn't right for you anyway. Clark's face brightened at that, ready to ask why, when the fire alarm above the great hall suddenly shrieked. Water poured from the sprinklers like a sudden downpour. Ah! People screamed. Where did the water come from? Someone shouted. The alarm's going off. Where's the fire? Everyone was caught off guard and drenched. Elaborate makeup ran, hairspray set styles collapsed, and panic spread. David's pastry lay soggy, his clothes were wet, and his face darkened. Is it an accident? He asked. Clark scanned the room. He saw no fire, no smoke. Is the fire alarm broken? Was something triggered outside? Or, bang, the great hall doors were kicked open. Clear footsteps echoed as everyone turned toward the doorway. Screech! God says everyone is born with original sin, a thin figure in a hooded cloak announced as he stepped in. He lifted his hood, revealing a cold, pale face, and silver arcs of electricity lanced from his hands like coiling snakes. A scent of ozone and burning filled the air. Although my target this time isn't all of you, he went on, pausing as the crowd stared in terrified confusion, I don't mind helping you wash away your sins in advance. He slammed one palm, crackling with enough electricity to melt steel, onto a wet patch of floor. The juice of the sprinklers made the hall a dangerous conductor. The packed room held its breath as the stranger prepared whatever ruin he intended to unleash. 11. Kill him, Clark. 11. Kill him, Clark. First, the fire alarm went off and drenched everyone with the sprinklers. Now a person who could discharge electricity had appeared in the school lobby. It was obvious this wasn't an accident. It was a carefully staged act of carnage. David raised an eyebrow as he looked at the figure in the doorway. He'd long suspected the strange rumors about this town weren't baseless. Kryptonite radiation probably caused mutations in some people, he thought. The rich rely on technology, the poor on mutation. He hadn't imagined, though, that a madman would show up intent on killing almost everyone at the high school. Ah! The students screamed. What kind of horror movie is this? People cried. Chloe and Pietro trembled. Anyone with half a brain knew what an electric current could do in a place full of wet floors. One touch of that man's hands to the ground could kill hundreds. Raise your hands, the man ordered. Some boys wanted to rush him, but it was hopeless. The thin, demonic figure slammed his crackling hands to the floor. In less than a second, no one standing 20 or 30 meters away could have reached him. David frowned and moved to act. Saving these people would have been effortless for him. He even thought, if everyone here dies and only Clark and I survive, we'll attract messy scrutiny from people with agendas. David, no, someone shouted. But someone was faster. Clark glanced at David, at the danger beside him, and his face went pale. He vanished from where he stood, moving with a speed that stole the moment. Sizzle. With less than 10 centimeters between Jerome's electrified hands and the floor, Clark had already swept him up over his shoulder and carried him away. What happened? People shouted. Where did he go? Terrified students squeezed their eyes shut, braced for pain that never came. When they opened them, the killer was gone. Only a cold wind drifted in through the doorway, making people shiver. Was it a vision? Someone whispered. A few who had tried to tackle Jerome never saw what had happened. Clark had moved far faster than human eyes could follow, leaving no afterimage. David set his snack down slowly, relief easing his shoulders. It seemed Clark still had hope. He hadn't completely fallen. His brother hadn't forgotten his family for a girl who already had a boyfriend, but had been giving other boys strange attention. Still, how would Clark handle the fallout? If he mishandled things, it could bring trouble to the family. David frowned, then stepped back and vanished from the lobby the way Clark had. Chloe frantically patted her chest, staring at the empty floor. They were right here, she said. Pietro scanned the room. Maybe they got bored and left while we were dancing? He tried to make light of it, but doubt flickered in Chloe's eyes. She'd seen the brothers there moments before. Had she imagined it? On an outlying road outside town, Clark threw Jerome to the pavement and glared at him. Do you know there were hundreds of people in there? Why am I here? Jerome asked, getting to his feet and looking at his hands and then around in confusion. He hadn't intended to kill anyone. How had he ended up on a country road? When he saw who had brought him here, his posture went tense and wary. It's you. I saw you at the bar, Jerome said, recognition and anger sharpening his voice. They almost used you as a scarecrow. His face soured with betrayal. Electricity danced across his palms, bright and terrifying under the streetlights. The The crackle sounded like crows on a wire, and the current shot out across the dark field. And you want to protect them? What difference was there, Jerome thought, between those boys in football jerseys and the people who had nailed him to a cross over a decade ago? He roared and unleashed a blast of power that hurled Clark backward. Clark tumbled 7 or 8 meters, hit the pavement, then pushed himself up as if nothing had happened, brushing sparks from his jacket. You want to kill Whitney and the others? Absolutely not, Clark said, realizing Jerome's aim. Even if Whitney was a rival in love, and even if he'd been wronged, it wasn't a crime worth death. Jerome's eyes went mad. God sent me back to the human world. I have a mission to purify evil. He formed arcs of electricity in his hands, like 2 tiny suns of converging lightning. The current struck the asphalt, which glowed raw and began to melt, giving off the sulfurous stench of burned tar. Die! Jerome shouted and thrust his hands forward. Lightning braided through the air with a thick main trunk and a network of branches, moving faster than sound. Clark couldn't dodge in time. He twisted his arms up into a shield. The sleeves on his jacket flared into ash. Pain lanced through him, and he cried out, but then he moved, sudden and precise as a bullet, appearing beside Jerome in the blink of an eye. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to stretch, then snap back. Jerome's body arcs like he'd been hit by a truck, flew 10 meters and slammed into the ground. Ah! He coughed up blood, grimacing as if several ribs had been broken. I don't understand why anyone would defend the people who bully them. Jerome gasped, clutching his chest and glaring at Clark. How could someone he expected to hate them protect them instead? It felt like betrayal. Clark noticed the ghastly scars that riddled Jerome's palms, rows of wounds as if steel nails had pierced them. His face tightened. He remembered Chloe mentioning a strange series of deaths during their break. Former members of the town's high school football team had been electrocuted one by one. Are you the one who murdered them? Are you hunting the football team? Clark demanded. Jerome, furious and in pain, staggered to his feet. I'll kill you, he snarled, advancing. Don't get up again. I don't want to accidentally kill you, Clark said, hands raised, suddenly awkward. He'd never seriously fought anyone before and feared causing a fatality. Jerome's anger only grew. Despite his injuries, he forced himself upright. If he intends to kill you, then kill him, Clark, someone cried. Just as Clark hesitated, a cold voice cut through the night. David, what's going on with your health? Clark stared at the figure stepping out of the shadows under the streetlights, someone he knew all too well and yet who had no business being here. Footsteps announced David as he emerged. David, what did you say? Clark was baffled and more than a little alarmed. How did you get here? I brought him out of town. Even if you drove, you couldn't have made it from school this fast. And if he hadn't misheard, had his brother really told him to kill someone, David's voice was calm. I said kill him, Clark. David ignored Clark's questions, glanced at Jerome, who had only just managed to get to his feet, and repeated, solemn and precise. From Jerome, anger plus no 2, murderous intent plus no 2. Unexpectedly, David's voice cataloged emotional points like a scanner. They were tiny compared to what Clark sensed, but they were real. Jerome's face was enough evidence of what he'd done. Clark had been raised by Martha to believe in the law and in mercy. We can't just kill him, Clark said, appalled. Turn him in. Let the police handle it. David's expression didn't change. If you don't do it, I will. Clark's stomach dropped. No, how can we kill someone? He's already a maniac. Maybe he deserves it, but we can't take the law into our own hands. You let him see your face, David said abruptly. Clark froze. He had forgotten to hide his identity. At the thought of Jerome knowing who he was, his face went pale. He understood then why David had reacted so fast. Jerome, for his part, showed no fear when he faced Clark, but the moment David moved, something in Jerome's posture shifted. There was an unease in it, like the difference between a gentle beast and a predator. Before Jerome could act, lightning cracked through the air. Electricity arced, aimed at Jerome, but David was gone from where he'd stood. He didn't possess literal superspeed, only velocity close to the speed of sound, but that was plenty. When he reappeared, it was at Jerome's side. To eliminate future trouble, I'm bringing your death sentence forward, David said. He grabbed Jerome by the throat with one hand and lifted him like a chick. Jerome's face choked purple as his legs kicked uselessly in the air. "What kind of monster are you?" he spat, eyes wide with panic. He wrapped both hands around David's wrist and in desperation tried to activate his own power. "Let me go!" Crack! Electric current slammed into David's hand, burning away half a sleeve, but it didn't even make him flinch. His grip was like an iron vice. "David, your looks," Clark whispered, staring at him. David's skin had taken on an almost unnatural pallor, a shade of purple at the edges, his eyes cold as death. Clark's voice wavered. He didn't dare pull harder. He was certain he might hurt his brother. "He's killed more than one person. He deserves to die, isn't he?" Jerome wheezed, trying to slip between panic and defiance. "We don't do lynchings," Clark said, pleading. "If father and mother were here, they wouldn't let you do this." David could have snapped Jerome's neck in an instant, but he didn't. There was a merciless calm in him now, and Clark saw something he hadn't before. David wasn't just angry, he was calculating. Clark tried to move. He blurred his motion, left an afterimage where he'd stood, and lunged to grab David's wrist. "Put him down, brother." He pulled with everything he had. The road cracked under the strain. The force in Clark's hands could have bent a thick steel bar. Still, David held as if rooted to the earth. "How did you do that? Are you really David?" "You're not the only one with secrets," David said, looking at Clark. For a second, his grip tightened, and Jerome choked more fiercely. Clark's face crumpled. "Think about Mom and Dad. Don't do this. Some things, once crossed, you can't uncross." Seconds stretched. The two brothers looked at each other. When David finally let go, it was as if all the air left the night. "Fine, you don't have to die," David said. He set Jerome down, but not gently. Then, almost casually, he slapped the back of Jerome's head with a single sharp blow. Jerome crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut, falling face first onto the asphalt, motionless. "You still killed him?" Clark cried as he knelt to check. Jerome was breathing, but he was unresponsive. His pupils were fixed. His body lay slack. David watched, cool. "I didn't kill him. I turned him into a vegetable so he can't harm anyone again." Clark's stomach lurched. That's cruel." "Are you going to call that lynching too?" David asked, lifting an eyebrow. "This is better than killing him outright. The brain's still awake in parts. It's useful for me." Clark had no answer. He had raised his voice to stop David from making a terrible mistake, and that was something. But seeing Jerome like this, alive, ruined, stung worse than death. "This ends here," Clark said finally. "Take him somewhere that will take responsibility. Don't get involved with this anymore." David glanced down at Jerome's listless form as if noting a score. From Jerome, fear plus 0.04, anger plus 0.03, hatred 0.04. A steady stream of points filled the air in David's tone, like someone reading a tally. "A vegetable can't wake up, but part of his brain is still conscious. That will be more useful than killing him." Clark gathered Jerome under the arms and, with a brief blur, lifted him. "I put him at the town hospital entrance," he said, then was gone. David didn't move far before he turned back on the path where Clark had left. "Now we go back to school. We need to be where people will notice if we're gone." He studied the faint trail Clark had left when he moved and mused out loud, "Right now my strength and defense are far superior to Clark's, but Clark's speed gives him an advantage." Clark caught up, panting slightly, but shaken in a way David could see. He kept glancing at his brother, at David's altered appearance, at the cold efficiency in him. There were questions behind Clark's eyes, more than one he wanted to ask. David had revealed too much tonight, and Clark realized painfully that he had never really understood his brother at all. 13, don't bite me. Jarek was tall and thin like a praying mantis, with messy hair and round glasses. At school, he was considered a freak because he collected insects. Timid and always avoiding other people's eyes, he kept to himself. Even the bullies didn't bother him, who wanted to mess with a boy who spent all his time with dirty bugs. Late that night, Jarek came home in a black tuxedo, dejected. He hadn't had the courage to go to the dance. He'd almost reached the school before turning back. Worse, one of the jars holding his beloved insects had been left open recently, and he'd woken up covered in red bites. He couldn't face the dance like that, and certainly couldn't let the girl he liked see him. The living room was brightly lit. Slap! His mother's face hardened when she saw him. She threw a stack of photos and several videotapes onto the sofa. The photos were of his classmate Lana, shot from every angle at different times of day and night, almost like a stalker's collection. The tapes showed the same things. "You can't be sneaking into a girl's room and taking pictures," his mother exploded. "Lana's aunt, Nell, and I are in the same club. She showed me these. How am I supposed to explain this?" Garrick shouted in panic as he hurriedly stuffed his jars back into boxes. "How could you do this? You opened my things. Lana was my." His mother's voice wavered on the edge of tears. "I can't let you go on like this. I've been too soft, respecting your privacy when I shouldn't have. Secret pictures, living with insects in your room, withdrawing from everyone. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling Claremont Military Academy. I won't let you stay like this." "No. If you send me away, what will happen to my insects?" Jarek cried. "You should have stopped this strange obsession long ago. Tomorrow, I'm throwing them all out." She was furious and hurt. Jarek slammed his door and retreated to his room. He stood in front of the jars and bottles containing butterflies, beetles, and spiders, and his face smoothed into that obsessive, adoring expression he wore with his insects. "You're so beautiful. No one will hurt you. I'll take you somewhere safe," he whispered. The soil in the jars glowed a pale green in the dim light. He'd found a meteorite a while back, crushed it to powder, and mixed it into each container. It shimmered at night and made the insects look otherworldly. He'd even sent a glowing butterfly to Lana as a gift. "I wish I'd seen Lana's face when she got it," he murmured regretfully, then packed faster. He loaded every jar in the house into the back of his old car, planning to hide the insects in the abandoned treehouse from his childhood and avoid being shipped off to military school. Click, the car started. He ignored his mother's shouts as he drove away, a cold sneer on his lips as he set course for the treehouse. He hadn't gone far, just out of town, when the car hit a muddy rut. Crash! The boxes overturned, jars smashed. Freed, the insects dusted with meteorite powder swarmed inside the cramped car and began attacking Garrick as he drove. "No, don't bite me," he screamed. The stinging was unbearable. He fought the wheel. The car veered off and slammed into roadside brush. The glowing insects bit frantically. Garrick's screams echoed across the deserted countryside and then faded. Eventually, he slipped into unconsciousness. Back at the Great Hall, the dance had dissolved into chaos after a terrifying scare that left everyone trembling and soaked, people drifting out like drowned rats. The dancing stopped altogether. Someone called the police. The town officers arrived quickly. Parents, frantic at the news that their children had nearly been attacked, rushed to pick them up. Ambulances, police cars, and parents' vehicles nearly blocked the school gate. Jonathan and Martha hurried over, but couldn't find their two sons in the crowd. "Chloe, have you seen them?" Martha asked the little girl who'd been to their farm and left such a strong impression. "I don't know, Aunt Martha," Chloe answered. Wrapped in a blanket and sitting on the school steps with her father, she added, "They should be fine." "Dad, Mom, we're here." They heard Clark call out. Clark and David appeared a moment later. "Where did you go?" Chloe asked, puzzled. Clark scratched the back of his head, uncomfortable. "David and I didn't have dance partners, and halfway through it got boring, so we stepped outside for some fresh air." Seeing Chloe and Pietro's parents on the scene, Clark and David came over. The two boys looked ragged. Their clothes had been changed into outfits that ought to have been neatly folded at home. Jonathan patted their shoulders and asked briefly, checking them over, "Are you both all right?" "Fine, Father," David said with a small smile. Clark echoed it, nerves showing in his voice. Jonathan and Martha exchanged a look and silently agreed not to press for details in the middle of the crowd. The attacker had vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. It wasn't clear whether it was a real attack or some elaborate prank. Given how frightened everyone had been and how the person or thing disappeared, people were trying to make sense of it without leaping to conclusions. The town police took statements methodically. They questioned many witnesses, but did not suspect Clark and David. The attacker's description didn't match the brothers' slender frames, and there was no proof anything criminal had happened beyond mass panic. Parents murmured to one another. "It's a shame. This should have been a wonderful night for the kids," one said. "As long as the children are safe," Jonathan replied. After a short time, each parent took their children home. That evening, Jonathan and Martha sat on the sofa, looking at their sons. They spoke quietly, still unnerved. "So it really wasn't a prank?" Martha asked. "Someone who can emit electricity?" After hearing the boys' version of what had happened at the dance, and after Clark had hauled the attacker away, David, feeling uneasy, had followed. He'd torn his clothes climbing over the school fence and then watched Clark subdue the man. "You did very well, Clark. You saved your brother and everyone else," Jonathan said, voice thoughtful and serious. "We still want you to keep your abilities hidden, but that doesn't mean you should stand back when someone's in danger. We believe there's a reason God gave you these gifts." "God?" Clark said, suddenly uncomfortable. He'd been awkward enough about the idea that his brother hadn't needed saving in the first place. "What's wrong?" Jonathan noticed his son's expression. "Nothing. Just that the man at the dance kept saying God gave him his powers," David said with a small smile. "The God I mean isn't him, anyway." Jonathan scratched his cheek. He and Martha weren't particularly religious. "By the way, what happened to the man you subdued in the end?" Clark hesitated. How could he explain? Earlier, he had cornered David and asked about the changes in his brother's body. David had answered only that they'd talk at home, and had asked Clark to keep it a secret for now. "Clark, you'll keep my secret, right?" His brother's voice from that conversation echoed in his head. Clark had promised he would. Clark couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. David cut in with a grin. He was pushed down by Clark and fell, ended up in a vegetative state. "What?" Jonathan and Martha nearly leapt off the sofa in surprise and turned to Clark, whom they had been just praising. "Dad, Mom, you know Clark's always been exceptionally strong," David went on brightly. "I don't think we can blame him." The sentence hit Clark with a familiar sting. It echoed what he'd said to Chloe and someone else when he'd been late for school, that David had never really cared about him. He felt a flash of shame at how easily his brother let him take the blame. "Clark, is that really what happened?" his father asked. Yes, it is." Clark grit his teeth. He had promised. Jonathan suddenly stood, his face grave. He pressed his hands down on Clark's shoulders. "Starting tomorrow, you need to practice controlling your strength out on the farm. What if next time you use too much force and accidentally kill someone?" Okay. Clark tasted bitterness, but nodded. His parents weren't harsh. They were just scared. The man at the dance had been a murderer who deserved punishment. Still, Jonathan and Martha insisted, sternly and repeatedly, that Clark work on control, and they planned to watch him do it. "You're despicable, David," Clark muttered later, after they'd escaped the parents' questions and retreated to the attic of the warehouse to breathe. David folded his arms and looked at him through the window at the starry sky. "Practicing strength isn't a bad thing for you," he said. Then, with a teasing look at you today. You handled that guy like someone trying to help a hedgehog cross the road. You can't touch it. You can't not touch it. You looked lost. "I've always been able to control my strength to the level of an ordinary person," Clark said. It was true. Otherwise, there'd have been far worse accidents over the years. "But what if your opponent is stronger than an ordinary person?" David asked. "What if you need to deal with someone like that? How many superpowered people am I supposed to deal with?" Clark snapped. He felt like David was making things up just to justify bossing him around. David didn't answer immediately. The meteor shower that had come with Clark had dragged strange people into their town. At least 7 or 8 oddities had shown up, and who knew how many more were out there. Clark pressed on, lowering his voice. "David, tell me about your body. Were you always like this? Or recently?" David had no reason to hide it now. "I've been like this since birth," he said. Having revealed his ability in the yard, he was done pretending he was normal. "Since birth," Clark's eyes widened. "Are you sure? Why can't you accept that I've hidden mine for over a decade while you've been blundering around exposing yours?" David shot back. Clark felt a complicated mix of guilt and resentment. As a kid, he had thought his strength was a gift. David, born with similar gifts, had watched him with a cold, ashamed eye. "How do you know? I mean, how can you be sure you were born like this?" "Memories," David said, tapping his temple. "I remember things. I remember stories and images, like the stuff you hear about Thanos. Few people know the whole arc. As a child, he wanted to be a scientist, and his curiosity became obsession. He dissected small animals, then classmates, then, horrifically, even people close to him. He had a brilliant, twisted mind. It's not that I'm him, but I remember an appetite for experiments. That's how I learned. Clark felt chills at the thought, but David went on more practically. I learned my fighting from watching, from TV, from trial and error. You have to keep my secret, Clark, David said. After you used that to make me take the blame for turning someone into a vegetative state? Clark snapped, still stung. Think about what I look like after I use my strength. Do you want Mom and Dad worrying? I'll tell them eventually, after they've seen more of the abnormal. By then, they'll be better able to accept it. For now, let them have one normal kid they don't have to worry about. When his parents were mentioned, Clark softened. Where did you learn the method that can leave someone like that? He asked quietly. Was that on TV too? David's tone turned serious. The precise control needed, just the right tap at the back of the head to leave someone incapacitated, couldn't be learned from commercials. It took experiments. It took practice. Gotham isn't far from Metropolis, David said, turning and climbing down the stairs. When school had long breaks, I'd go there sometimes. You know the kind of place it is. Gotham, a city of shadows, where villains were part of the scenery. If you're willing to shoot 9 out of 10, maybe one would be wronged, but half the time you might just let a few escape, he said flatly. There's always someone in Gotham who deserves to be shot 100 times for the things they do. It wasn't hard to find people to experiment on. I learned the technique in a few tries. I've grown tired of the world where heroes throw people in prison, villains break out, and everything keeps repeating, David went on. So I decided to do something about it. Make the world quieter. Create some vegetatives. Give myself a few fewer headaches. Clark went very still. Gotham. The name carried a dark charm that made people shiver. Hearing that his brother had gone there, that he'd practiced on real people, froze him for a long moment. His face changed as what David had said sank in. Worried, Clark. The sky was velvet blue. Bright sunlight poured down, and a soft spring breeze stirred the cherry blossoms in the schoolyard. Petals drifted like confetti. Students moved between classes with books in their arms, chatting in small clusters. David and a few others walked through the building, Clark at David's side, worry creasing his brow as he stole glances at his younger brother. Like any parent fretting over a child, Clark felt the responsibility of an older brother to keep David from hardening into someone cold, or worse, because of the world. He discovered that David's strength far exceeded that of ordinary people, and he'd spent the whole night turning the problem over in his head, how to stop David from sliding into darkness. Casually beating a man senseless without a shred of remorse, Clark felt that was already far past a simple, bad streak. Clark thought David's emotions were standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong step, and his younger brother might start seeing himself above others. David noticed Clark's earnestness and had no idea how to respond. Worry from Clark, +6, 5, 7. Since yesterday, Clark's emotional output had spiked as if he'd been worrying about David nonstop. David couldn't help a small grin. At this rate, he might complete the full fusion and unlock the next template sooner than expected. He wondered what the next template would be, weaker on par with the Thanos template, or even stronger. They reached the corridor. Students kept stealing curious looks at them. Pietro preened, whispering, "Finally everyone's noticed. Being short doesn't stop my charm." "Keep it down, Pietro." Chloe looked up from the newspaper she'd been reading. They're staring at Clark and David, mostly David. David didn't have Clark's super hearing, but his keen senses made it easy to pick up the reason from passing whispers. Smallville was the sort of town where news spread faster than wildfire. A rumor had circulated. A group of the high school's football players had tried to bully someone at a bar and come away on the losing end. Clark's expression flickered with helplessness. He'd heard the story too. The older brother, tall and gangly, had been pinned and humiliated, only for the younger brother to stumble in and quickly put several of the bullies down. "Lana's coming this way," Pietro said, nudging Clark. "Lose that pathetic look that screams, 'Why am I a loser?'" Was it that obvious? Clark straightened imperceptibly as Lana, her black hair framing a face still damp with tears, hurried toward them. She looked heartbreak-struck. She rushed up to Clark and spoke in a soft, hoarse voice. "Clark, I'm so sorry. I didn't know Whitney would act like that. He was childish for bothering you just because I said hello." She'd gone straight to Whitney to find out what happened, hoping it would turn out to be a rumor. Whitney, embarrassed and angry, had admitted the truth and blamed Lana's slight shift in attitude toward Clark for provoking him. "I'm okay, Lana," Clark said quickly, smiling. "Don't blame Whitney." Lana's voice dropped, thick with hurt. "I can't accept that he lied to me. He lost the necklace I gave him. He said someone at the bar was drunk and started it. I need to rethink things with Whitney," she added, eyes red. Clark, who'd never been in this position before, scratched the back of his head and floundered for something comforting. Maybe he was drunk and didn't know what he was doing. David rolled his eyes inside his head. Clark would console the girl he liked, even if it meant defending the guy she was upset at. No kryptonite required. Clark's personality was already a losing trait for winning Lana over. "David." Clark gave him a subtle wink, a silent signal. They'd found the meteorite necklace yesterday. Clark hoped returning it might ease Lana's pain. Lana's eyes lit up as she remembered. "I'm sorry about all this, David. Because of me, Whitney caused trouble for you guys." "It's nothing," David said calmly. He reached into his pocket, took out the necklace, and handed it to her. "This is yours. Clark found it and asked me to keep it safe." Clark had wanted to hand it to her himself, but he suspected that if he made a show of it, he'd end up sprawled on the floor in some dramatic display and humiliate himself all over again. Better to let David do it. Lana clutched the necklace, surprise melting into a smile across her tear-stained face. "Thank you, David and Clark." She misread the situation. If Clark had found it, why hadn't he returned it? She assumed David was trying to set her up with his older brother. She studied David a little longer than most people would, curious. He didn't play sports, and he often sat alone with a book. He was tall but not bulky. How had he managed to put Whitney and his teammates down? Clark watched Lana watch his brother, and his heart sank. He had a bad feeling. Footsteps thundered around the corner. "Lana!" Whitney's voice came, tight and contrite. He'd regretted his outburst and was trying to catch up to make amends. "David, Clark, I'm gonna go." Lana didn't want to face him. After a quick hello to Chloe and Pietro, she turned and hurried away. Whitney passed by, spotted David, and his face flickered with regret and anger. He left with a mix of shame and fury burning behind him. David didn't care. From around the stairwell corner, a figure watched in silence, eyes cold as a predator's, shifting between David and Clark. 16. Insects. Looking for a mate. Someone was watching him. David felt it before his eyes landed on the figure, and the others turned too. A man in a black jacket with slicked-back blonde hair moved across the schoolyard. His face was cold, predatory, like an indifferent hunter at the top of the food chain. He barely seemed to notice the four of them as he walked in the direction Lana had gone. "Was that Jarek?" Chloe breathed. It took Pietro a few seconds to register, his head turning slowly. Chloe's eyes were wide with shock. She used to commission Jarek to write insect science pieces for her Torch newspaper, but the Jarek she knew was awkward and would never make direct eye contact with a girl. This man hadn't just taken off his glasses and changed his clothes. His whole manner had shifted. Chloe rubbed her arm, uneasy. "He gave me goosebumps." It wasn't embarrassment or shyness, but an instinctive chill, like a deer sensing a hyena. David and Clark didn't share the feeling. The four of them kept talking as they headed toward the classroom. Chloe smoothed the newspaper against the wall of the activity office and pointed to another clipping. "Look at this. Jerome Cree. Remember him? He was a student here over 10 years ago. After the meteorite shower, he was found in a coma. There was an electrical accident at the state hospital, and he disappeared from the ward. He turned up yesterday outside Smallville Hospital." "Someone stole a comatose patient and dumped him outside our hospital?" Pietro frowned. "What's the point of that?" David and Clark exchanged a look. Clark's face tightened. "I'm putting it on my wall of weird," he said. Chloe's wall of weird filled a whole wall in the school's activity editorial office with cuttings about meteorite-related oddities. She taped the latest article into place. "There's nothing small about weirdness," Clark muttered guiltily. "But the weird part is this. A doctor noticed that Jerome Cree hasn't aged in over 10 years. No explanation." On the wall, a magazine cover caught David's eye. "It's Lana," he said quietly. The photo showed a young Lana in a frilly pink dress, holding a fairy wand, as if she'd been dressed for a day at the amusement park, except she looked dirty and exhausted, her face streaked with tears. The headline read, "Heartbroken Angel After the Meteorite Shower." The meteorite shower a decade ago had been devastating. Many people died, including Lana's parents. It was that tragedy that had made Clark notice her in the first place. Over time, his private glances had settled into something more complicated. Their biology class that day had been on insects. Insects, the arthropods among invertebrates, are the most numerous animals on Earth, the teacher said. Cockroaches, ants, bees, don't underestimate them. They have enormous potential and can do things that seem impossible to us. But many of them have short lives, like shooting stars. Once they mature, driven by strong genetic instincts, they race to find a mate. They'll do anything to defeat rivals and leave offspring. By the time the bell rang, the day had slipped away. Dusk was starting to stain the horizon when David and Clark left the campus. At the school gate, Jarek, the same cold stranger they'd seen earlier, was smiling as he talked to Lana, who looked tired. "Lana, you look like you'd use a good cup of coffee. There's a nice shop in town. Want to go?" he asked, holding out a stack of homework. "And, could you help me with my literature report?" Lana's voice was flat. "Jarek, I told you at lunch that I really appreciate the butterfly you gave me, but I'm not up for that right now. Please, leave me alone." Whitney hovered nearby, desperate, chasing after her across the campus and pestering her. All it gained him was a formal breakup. Lana had just come out of a bad relationship and was exhausted. "Oh, okay," she agreed finally. Jarek smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Lana nodded to David and Clark as she passed, clutching her books, looking worn out. Chloe shook her head, half amused. Even with the makeover, he still doesn't know how to talk to girls. Pietro patted Clark playfully on the shoulder and winked. Clark brightened. "Tell my folks I'll be home late," he said, sounding sheepish. David, arms crossed, gave a wry warning as he walked past. "If you end up walking home with a girl and run into trouble, protect yourself first, Clark." Lana had put on her kryptonite necklace again. If some cliched alleyway scuffle happened and Clark tried to be the big hero, he'd be in trouble. David wasn't about to let the future Superman get himself beaten to a pulp for show. Clark smiled in resignation and ran off to catch up with Lana. David and Pietro climbed aboard the school bus and left, joking under their breath. At the gate, Garrick watched Clark follow Lana with that same cold expression. Whitney, frustrated and clumsy, barged up to him and shoved a warning into his face. "Stay away from my girlfriend." Jarek didn't flinch. He slapped Whitney hard on the shoulder, the grip like a hydraulic press. Bones cracked audibly. Whitney yelped in pain and lashed out, trying to break free. "Let me go." "You're out, Whitney," Jarek said flatly. He threw Whitney backward with terrifying ease. Whitney went flying like a rag doll, knocking over a trash can and landing in a heap, unconscious. The onlookers screamed. Jarek ignored them all and turned his attention to Clark, still trailing behind Lana, and then glanced at the departing school bus. "I'll be the one who wins the mate," he murmured, voice cold and certain. Then he walked away. 17. Clark's Dream and Luther. "David, Clark, we're going out to the market on the edge of town today to sell fruit. You two need to help load the truck later." It was a rare day off, and his mother's voice called up from downstairs. The wooden stairs creaked under his feet as Clark descended. David answered their mother, casually bringing up the odd thing that had happened at school the day before. Jarek had changed. His appearance and demeanor were different, almost like a genetic mutation. His heartbeat had been much slower than normal. There were plenty of people with genetic differences in this town. It was best not to provoke them. They sat at the table. Jonathan was quietly eating cereal. Clark preferred warm bread with blueberry jam. "Clark," Martha called again from the kitchen when their eldest still hadn't appeared. A dull thud and the sound of splintering wood came from upstairs. "When did Clark start sleeping so testy?" Jonathan joked. "Are you all right, Clark?" Martha called, half laughing. From upstairs, Clark's voice sounded flustered. He appeared at the table a moment later looking like a child who'd been caught in trouble. "My bed broke," he said sheepishly. "Your bed broke. What happened?" Jonathan asked, a frown of concern crossing his face. Adolescence brought sudden growth. Had Clark's strength spiked again and overwhelmed him? "When I woke up, felt like I was floating," Clark said, the memory stubbornly refusing to sound ordinary. "Then I fell and snapped the bed leg." He hated how true it sounded, hated how it reminded him, again, that he was different, that something unearthly lived inside him. What else might happen that he couldn't control? "Floating?" Jonathan repeated, a little stunned. From super strength to speed and toughness, they had seen a lot, but flight had always been humanity's oldest dream. Martha, perceptive as ever, reached across and took his hand. "Clark, whatever talents you have, you're our son," she said gently. "You're learning to master it," Jonathan added seriously, trying to bolster his son's confidence. "Don't be afraid. You're not alone. Countless birds enjoy the sky freely." Clark realized the beginnings of an ability to fly had awakened. David, who had been quietly buttering his bread, said without much surprise, "I thought it might be something else." "What?" Clark asked. David swallowed, looking suddenly awkward. "Nothing. When you woke up, I thought I heard some noise from next door, like someone muttering in their sleep, saying a name over and over." Clark's face flushed. He had been flying in a dream. He drifted over to Lana's house, hovered by her bed, just watching her sleep. He swore he'd done nothing while asleep, but the dream had felt intoxicating. Had he actually spoken aloud? Martha frowned at the idea. "Clark, did you have a nightmare?" "It's nothing." Clark lied, choking on his milk and changing the subject. "Hurry up with breakfast. We need to load the truck, or we'll lose our spot." After breakfast, they were at the farm entrance. Clark lifted box after box of fruit from the barn. What weighed dozens of pounds for anyone else felt like feathers in his hands. He stacked them into the pickup with effortless speed. When he turned, he'd already moved 7 or 8 boxes, and David had barely set 2 in place, moving at a leisurely pace. "Can you hurry up?" Clark couldn't help snapping. "Clark, your brother doesn't have your strength. Don't rush him," Martha scolded gently. Clark opened his mouth to retort. He knew the truth, remembered the times he couldn't even budge David's arm with all his strength. He'd always held back on the farm, doing the heavy work himself to help his aging parents, tractor, fence posts, driving the plow. It hadn't bothered him then. But since finding out David also had extraordinary strength, a slow burn of resentment had grown. David had watched while Clark had carried the workload. Now, with David idly lingering, it stung more than it used to. He kept it to himself. He couldn't tell his parents the whole truth. When Clark had finally shifted the last crate, he hopped into the truck. "It's a bit cramped. Dad won't be comfortable driving." "You sit in the back," David said, waving him off toward the truck bed. The pickup only had 1 front bench. 3 could squeeze in, but 4 would be crowded. "Why don't you take it?" David asked, oddly self-righteous for a younger brother. Clark stared, startled. Normally, he would have been the first to get in the back, always worried that David might fall and get hurt. Seeing David insist on the front seat rubbed him the wrong way, so Clark clenched his jaw, took a breath, and trudged to the back. Jonathan and Martha exchanged puzzled looks. This wasn't like Clark. Usually there was no hesitation. Were the boys arguing? Martha glanced at Clark and then at David, worry knitting her brow. The engine turned over, and they drove. Clark sat in the bed with a basket of apples, feeling slightly deflated. At the market, the Kent family found a good spot near the center, set up their tent, and arranged the fruit so it looked inviting. Clark hammered a nail through a stake to hang the wooden sign, "Kent Farm Fresh Fruit." He barely needed to press. The nail drove in with hardly any effort, and it was tempting to do things quickly and quietly. "Aren't you worried about being seen, using your strength so openly?" David teased as he took a seat. Clark made a face. The temporary market had gathered people from around the county. Stalls of flowers, hot dogs, and produce lined the grass, and families wandered between them. "I'm not as subtle as you," David said, smiling. They had been at this for years. Clark had always been careful. Even now he'd checked around before using a little extra strength. He sat next to David, watching customers and shading his eyes. "Clark, I didn't expect to see you here." A clear voice broke through the market noise. Both boys looked up. David's eyes caught a bald head shining in the sun like a small light bulb. "Lex Luthor?" David said, surprised. 18. Attack halfway, Luthor? "Call me Rex. You saved my life, Clark." Rex Luthor stood in an expensive silver-gray suit, looking young and composed like a polished professional. Only the faintest trace of the playfulness and arrogance of a wealthy heir lingered around his features. He wasn't yet the cold, calculating billionaire the world would come to know. "Even if you refused my gift," he added lightly, "I hope you won't be distant." Clark laughed and relaxed. "Why are you here, Rex?" Rex had left a good impression on Clark. He'd even given Clark a pickup truck as thanks. "Why shouldn't I be here?" Rex replied with a practiced smile. "Do you think I spend all my time in nightclubs, boutique shops, and car dealerships, squandering money and partying?" David raised an eyebrow. An heir to a fortune wandering the countryside like any ordinary man, stumbling into a market, buying hot dogs and fruit to lift his spirits? Rex shot back with amused dignity. "Don't be ridiculous. Can't a man take a walk and clear his head?" Clark tilted his head, a little puzzled. He could tell David didn't much like Rex, and that puzzled him. He also felt a pang of sympathy for the younger Luthor. The last time Clark had visited Luthor Manor to return the truck, he'd spent a few minutes talking with Rex. Rex had explained his baldness in a casual, wry way. More than 10 years ago, his father had taken him to inspect a fertilizer factory outside town, and they'd been caught in a meteor shower. The radiation had made him lose his hair. "Because of it," Rex had said, "my father looked down on me, and my classmates treated me like a freak. But it taught me something. Being alone helps you think. Cattle and sheep flock together. Predators often walk alone." Clark remembered that tone, carefree on the surface, but with a shadow beneath. Now, in the market, Rex's smile was polished, and his manners impeccable. He had the kind of upbringing that showed in every courteous gesture. He spoke as if reciting ambitions and lessons. "Today's car glass came from a failed chemical experiment, and the cola everyone drinks started when a pharmacist tried to make a headache remedy," he said. "Big opportunities often start like seeds buried in the soil. Someone with vision finds them and nurtures them into something towering." "Did you come here looking for seeds, then?" Clark teased. "Have you found one yet, Luthor?" David asked slowly. "Not yet," Rex admitted, but his smile didn't falter. "What you're looking for most of all is patience." David met his gaze and felt a chill. He thought Rex was already convinced he'd found a seed, Clark. A man who had been struck head-on by an out-of-control sports car at over 200 miles per hour, who had crashed through a concrete bridge railing into the river and walked away without a scratch. Such a person was rare. Today might be the beginning of Rex's interest. At that moment, Jonathan and Martha returned from a successful sale, faces flushed with the glow of closing a deal. "A customer's having a party and loved our fruit," Jonathan told them. "We need more." Clark introduced Rex to his parents. "Mr. Kent, Mrs. Kent, pleased to meet you." Rex extended his hand with effortless warmth. Jonathan shook it politely, but did not seem eager to engage. The handshake was brief, and when he turned back to his sons, he sounded businesslike. "Hurry, you two. Don't keep the customer waiting." David and Clark stood and gathered their things. "Father has never been fond of the Luthors," Clark said as they walked out, frowning. "When the Luthor Group bought up land and put the fertilizer plant here, the river near the factory didn't used to be this color. The grass grew by the bank. The soil wasn't gray and stinking." David snorted. "Now there's a permanent scar across the town," he glanced back at Rex. "But that isn't Rex's doing." "Still," Clark said, looking thoughtful, "my dad's dislike goes back a long way." As they loaded the pickup, Chloe and Pietro appeared, waving. Who would pass up a sunny spring day? Chloe breathed, eyes bright. They were regulars at the Kent farm and friendly with the family. They chatted for a bit until Pietro's face went serious. "Have you heard about Jarek?" he asked. "Yesterday he knocked Whitney out at the school gate. She had to go to the hospital. The police found his mother murdered at home, wrapped in something like a net. Jarek's missing." "Are you saying he killed his mother?" Clark asked, incredulous. Chloe shrugged helplessly. "The police suspect him. Maybe something's wrong with him, mental illness, or something changed in him. If he did it, be careful if you see him. Pietro echoed the warning. Be careful. Someone who could do that is dangerous. David, who had been listening with a thoughtful frown, felt a sudden flash of something like apprehension. Could exposure to meteorite radiation cause mutations that altered both body and mind? He pushed the thought away, focusing on the present. Where's your stall? He asked Chloe. We're done here. Let us help. After pointing them toward the stand, Chloe and Pietro went to assist. David and Clark climbed into the pickup and drove onto the highway. The countryside road was empty and wide. Clark's hands were steady on the wheel, but his eyes kept drifting off the asphalt. Watch the road, Clark, David said. If we end up wrecked, it'll cost the farm. If Jarek really has gone off the rails. Clark trailed off, voice tight. Is Lana safe? Suddenly David's tone changed. Move? He reached instinctively for the wheel. Above the road, perched in a tall roadside tree, a shadow detached itself and dropped. In an instant it struck, fast and brutal, like a mantis lunging for its prey. The thing soared across several meters with terrifying speed and force, hurtling straight for the pickup. Clark's heart lurched. David twisted the wheel as the creature slammed into the truck's hood, a thunder of impact that rattled the cab. The windshield spiderwebbed with cracks as metal screamed and tires fought for traction. The world narrowed to the sound of breaking glass and the desperate animal surge of a vehicle swerving wildly on the empty highway. 19. Do you want to be Superman too? Screech! Screech! On a deserted country road, the howl of tires cut through the stillness. A faint tang of burnt rubber lingered as an old red pickup swung wide around a bend, jerking to avoid a figure that had dropped down from above. Mid-air, the figure twisted violently at the waist, fingers reaching for the roof, but only grazed it, missing the grip. Screech! A shriek of metal on metal. The pickup spun off the road. David slammed the brakes. Clark leapt out of the passenger door. The person who had just risked a suicidal move was not lying dazed on the ground. Like an agile flea, he flipped and landed on his feet, steady as ever. Jarek? Black leather jacket, slicked back blonde hair, a profile Clark knew too well. Before the man could fully turn, Clark recognized him and demanded, "Why are you attacking us?" Clark had heard something had happened to Jarek's mother. A bad feeling tightened in his chest. "Was it you?" "She stood in my way. You're next." Jarek turned slowly, confidence radiating from him like a predator over prey trapped in a web. He did not rush his attack. He chuckled coldly. "Are you insane?" Clark reeled at the answer. "How could someone be so heartless? She's your mother. I'm not on the same level of life as you anymore." The timid, withdrawn Garrick Clark had known was gone. In his place was something that smelled of dominance, someone who believed himself at the top of a food chain. He spread his arms and sneered. "I answer to no morals or rules. I'm ahead of you. Ahead of everyone." "You want to be Superman too?" David said, eyes flicking to 5 clear gouges across the truck's roof where paint had been scraped away. His tone was flat and mocking. To claim a higher level of life in front of the son of Krypton and an eternal lineage, absurd. "David, you're asking for death." Jarek snarled at the insult. David didn't flinch. Clark stepped forward, trying to reason. Maybe Jarek had snapped and could be helped. "Jarek, listen. You need help. Help. You're the ones who should be eliminated." Jarek moved with ghostly speed, leaving a bright afterimage and threw a punch at David. "David, no!" Clark shouted, lunging to shield his brother. David's expression had gone colder than before. Jarek took Clark's alarm as concern for his younger brother, and his eyes narrowed. "I'll deal with you first." Before Jarek's fist reached him, David stood calm as if facing a bothersome fly. Then, faster than thought, a blow like an ancient battering ram slammed into Jarek's chest. Jarek was hurled back faster than he'd come, flew across the road, and crashed into the roadside grass more than 10 meters away, tumbling until he finally stopped. "Jarek?" Clark raced over, afraid David had killed him. On the edge of the road, David stood expressionless, his skin tinged purple, and his jaw marked with strange ridges like dried ravines. He exuded a quiet, intimidating power. Jarek groaned and staggered upright, staring at David in disbelief. He looked like a man who'd been through a monstrous transformation, bitten by something that carried meteorite dust, shed its skin, evolved. But David's purple skin? What had bitten him? He'd hardly been hurt at all. David raised an eyelid. Garrick's body was tough. The blow had been light. He regarded him with bored disdain. I don't know what you mean. Are their brains damaged too? Jarek spat. Your strength isn't enough to hurt me. Jarek slammed a fist into the ground. Dirt exploded, and he shot forward like a cannonball, the wind roaring ahead of his fist. Do you know a dung beetle can push 1,200 times its weight? He boasted, murderous intent flashing across his face. Stop, Garrick. You've lost it, Clark said as he moved in, faster than a space shuttle, trying to stand between his brother and the madman. But Jarek was stronger than Clark expected. His fist connected with Clark's face and sent him flying like a meteor for dozens of meters. David glanced at the son of Krypton, who had been flung away, and knew Clark had been holding back, trying not to treat Jarek like an ordinary person against steel, and had still been knocked flat. Garrick stormed forward again, fist raised big as a boulder, intent on crushing David's head. David turned his face with lazy calm and lifted a palm. He caught Jarrek's punch as if stopping a child's swat. The ferocious force met immovable stillness and halted. A white blast of air blew dust off the road and threw gravel in a deadly spray. The asphalt fractured, collapsing into a deep crater several meters across. Clark, who'd just rushed back, had to shield his eyes from the flying debris. A dung beetle? David said. No offense, I'm not into insect talk. He tightened his grip like a hydraulic press coming down with hundreds of tons of force. No, Garrick screamed as bones shattered with a crisp, terrible sound. His hand crumpled beneath David's hold. He fell to his knees, a piercing howl escaping him as splintered bone pierced through flesh and dark, reddish-green blood oozed from the ruined palm. David released him casually and examined the viscous stain on his own hand. Were you bitten by some insect and mutated? He remembered Garrick's earlier claim and frowned. There was something about it that made him feel disgusted. Die! Jarrek's fingers were mangled, twisted at odd angles. Instinct flared, and he swung his other arm in a desperate, vicious strike, only to hit nothing. David had disappeared to his side with reaction beyond normal human limits. Jarrek's speed was frightening, gusts of wind sweeping where he moved, but he had misjudged David's reserves. Your speed's not bad, David said as he clasped Garrick's remaining arm and with a casual motion snapped it like a stalk of corn. But if annoying insects weren't nimble, they wouldn't last long. No, my arm, Jarek wailed, collapsing a broken heap, pain contorting his face. The man had tested his newfound strengths after waking. His bones had felt as tough as steel, but under David's hands they fractured like dry twigs. An insect that thinks it can challenge humans should already know what happens next. David raised his hand to strike again. A flash, the blur of motion, and Clark materialized in front of Jarek. He put out his palm and held David back. Don't kill him. Luther robbed a bank? The whisper rippled through the crowd, then repeated as if afraid to be wrong. Jarek, trembling with pain, couldn't believe Clark was almost unharmed, only a little dusty. You're still alive? He spat. Or shall we let the law take him? David already knew what Clark was thinking. Clark's face went serious. We can't cross that line. They couldn't do anything that would disappoint their parents. David cut him off, and then let him tell everyone in Smallville about the freak brothers who are super strong? Clark hesitated. He didn't want trouble for his family, but he also refused to repeat David's ruthless tactic. Instinctively, he resisted the idea of asking Garrick's capture as mercy. Even discussing it with Jarek now would be naive. What should we do? Whoosh! Jarek, who should have been too hurt to move, sprang up and fled like the wind, kicking up dust as he ran toward the trees beside the road. David's eyes narrowed, his supervision locking on. Judging by his gait, Garrick's arms had recovered. The tenacious vitality of an insect, Clark thought. Clark, aren't you going to chase him? David asked, glancing at Clark, who had just blocked his view. Clark reacted. For now, they had to prevent Jarek from escaping and coming back for revenge on their parents. This time, he didn't hold back. In a blur, he closed the distance and cut off Garrick, who skidded to a halt at the edge of the woods, astonished to see Clark standing in front of him. A stone slid from Garrick's raised leather jacket pocket. He turned to flee again, only to find David a dozen meters behind him, having appeared out of nowhere. One brother was incredibly strong, the other moved faster than a rocket. Jarek regretted ever taking on these two before he'd even secured his dream girl. Regret from Garrick, plus 0.09. Clark made a sound and then, without warning, his strength drained. He dropped to a knee, weak. He glanced at the stone that had skittered a few meters away. Its gray-black crust showed green crystals inside, faintly glowing. A meteorite, just like Lana's necklace, but more than 10 times the size. His face went grim. Jarek, thinking he'd found his salvation, realized this meteorite might be tied to his own mutation, and worse, it was Clark's weakness. He reached for the stone to use it, but remembering David behind him, he turned and ran. Fear from Garrick, plus 0.22. What a pity. David stooped, picked up the meteorite, narrowed his eyes, and hurled it at Jarek's fleeing back. The stone screamed through the air with a sharp sonic boom. The force it carried was greater than an anti-material sniper round. It struck Jarek squarely in the head. Bang! Jarek, charging into the trees, exploded like a watermelon. The blast rippled through the foliage. Dark blood and white brain matter spattered across leaves and bark. Clark's hands were suddenly covered in gore, and his eyes went wide. David? I had no choice. There was no pity in David's voice. He spread his hands as if helpless. Jarek hadn't been immortal. His regeneration wasn't enough. If Jarek had been able to regenerate, David might not have had to kill him. Madness from Jerome, 0.15. Hatred, plus 0.11. Jerome's emotions had been getting more extreme over the past 2 days, supplying more and more of whatever currency this world seemed to measure, emotion points. David didn't know what being conscious but trapped in darkness felt like, but he suspected it was intolerable. That made Jerome's feeds more and more intense. You killed him, David. Clark's shout trembled. You could have caught up, moved the rock, and let me chase him. Regret from Clark, 16, anxiety, 15, worry, plus 13. David answered evenly. What if I'd caught him? What then? Do you have a better solution? He picked up the meteorite and started toward the road. I'm waiting for you to tell me a better plan, Clark. But is there one? Clark demanded. With the kryptonite radiation gone, his strength returned, and the sight of Garrick's ruined body filled him with remorse. He clenched his fists. David drove the car back onto the road. When Clark rejoined him, his hands were smeared with dirt, and a layer of shock still shadowed his face. What did you do? Clark demanded. I buried Garrick deep in the forest, David said. If we go by the law, you've destroyed evidence. You're an accomplice if anyone ever tries to investigate me and Garrick's death. David smirked. That's right. Clark looked up, painfully earnest. But you're my only brother. David shook his head. If you hadn't used that persistent stare, the sort of look a juvenile counselor gives a repeat offender, maybe I would have been touched for a second or two. He said it without warmth. David hadn't planned to kill Jarek. He hadn't expected Jarek to attack Clark and try to kill him too. Unsurprisingly, Lana was probably the cause, some strong insectile instinct to eliminate rivals. Jarek had regenerative power and couldn't be turned into an emotion point generator, so David had no choice. After that day, Clark had allowed himself to worry less about David. He thought he could keep David in check. But after the killing, Clark's worry shot back up and grew more intense. Worry from Clark, plus 19, plus 20. David ignored the brooding Clark as he sat in the passenger seat, casually watching the passing countryside. On the way, he secretly touched up the car's paint and used his powerful lungs to help the paint dry faster. Clark decided not to tell their parents. He didn't want to worry them over something he couldn't explain. Dealing with Garrick hadn't taken long. They loaded a car full of fruit and returned to the market in under an hour. Mr. Luther was still there, using the chance to learn about Smallville's fruit and vegetable trade while talking to Jonathan and Martha Kent. Martha thought if Mr. Luther wanted to become a local buyer, that could be good for the town's farmers, so she treated him more kindly than her husband. Hi, David greeted Chloe and Pietro, who were helping at the stall. The stand wasn't busy. The two teenagers had little to do. Mr. Luther, are my family's fruits that appealing? Clark joked when he saw Lex still lingering. Mr. Luther watched Clark's gloomy face, then looked at David, who seemed as if he'd just come back from a leisurely drive, and turned to Clark. What happened, Clark? He asked quietly, trying to build rapport. You look like you've had some trouble. Clark tried to force off the question. Nothing. Mr. Luther smiled. When I was a kid, I was a bit of a rascal, too. I was called to the counselor's office a lot. To keep people from reading me, I learned a little psychology. No need, Mr. Luther. My son can solve his own teenage problems. Jonathan interrupted, wrapping an arm around Clark and steering him away from prying. Mr. Luther was about to say more when a group of police, guns at the ready, pushed through the crowd. They flashed badges and held arrest warrants aloft. The onlookers scattered, forming a shocked ring around them. "Lex Luthor," an officer announced. "We're the Smallville police. We suspect you're involved in a bank robbery. Please come with us to assist our investigation." Robbery? Lex froze for a beat. "Many eyewitnesses saw you rob the town bank half an hour ago, armed, taking $100,000. You were reported to be wearing a bulletproof vest under your clothes, and even after being shot twice by the security guard, you managed to escape." Lex gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Me, risk being shot to rob the town bank for just $100,000? Jonathan and Martha exchanged worried glances. The crowd murmured. Lex Luthor's name carried weight. If anyone would buy a bank, it would be him, not rob it. Lex's eyes flicked to Clark and David. "I've been here for the past hour," he said. "The Kent family can vouch for me." Every head turned to the Kents. Jonathan found himself speechless.